Hi everyone, I am Dream Into Wealth. I know people watching this are trying to fall asleep. How are you? And I hope you are okay in life. Listen to my story and make yourself comfortable. Also, if y'all like this kind of stories, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.
The gold beneath the dust.
There was an old fell named Amos Redden. Lived somewhere twixt nowhere and the next, right on the edge of a wind-blown plain where the dirt turned gold under the sunset, but bought a man nothing in town. Folks used to say he was crazy, that he'd lost his mind, looking for fortune out in that dry land where even the crows flew in silence. But Amos, he wasn't hunting gold the way most men do. He was hunting something quieter, something that didn't shine but lasted. He came west when he was 25, a failed banker with nothing left but a rusted compass and a box of ledgers filled with debts that weren't even his own. He'd seen men ruin themselves chasing fast money back east, seen good families torn apart by a bad loan or a bad habit. So he left it behind, told himself he'd rather start from dust than drown in gold. For the first 10 years, he didn't have much to show for it. He ran cattle for a sell, sold a few pelts, worked mines when winter bit too hard. Folks thought he was drifting. But Amos wasn't lost. He was learning. He watched the way water carved the earth, how seasons cycled through ruin and rebirth, how a man could work himself to death and still owe the land more. And somewhere in those quiet years, he came to a realization that shaped the rest of his life. Ain't the digging that makes a man rich, he said once to a prospector. It's the knowing way not to dig. That idea stuck to him like dust on boots. While others burned through their luck looking for a strike, Amos studied the patterns of the land, of people, of time. He started keeping notes any you knew, but this time not in ledgers. He'd write down when the rains came, where the grass grew thicker, how the wind shifted come harvest. Before long, those notes began to look less like a wanderer musing and more like a map. When word spread that gold had been found upriver, the whole county emptied overnight. But Amos stayed put. He said there was too much noise in gold. Ain't no one listening to the earth no more, he told the local storekeeper.
But while others gambled their lives in the mountains, he stayed low, buying up patches of forgotten land, cheap, unwanted, dry bone. He planted mesquite, not for beauty or shade, but because it drew water. He dug wells slow, one at a time, always by hand. It took 20 years for folks to realize what he'd done. The gold rush towns up north turned ghostly. Too much greed, too little sense. But Amos' land had turned green. The wells he dug hit a water vein deep enough to feed half the valley. That same dirt everyone cursed for being useless now shimmered with promise. He built irrigation ditches, carved channels so precise they looked like music written on the ground. When the merchants came riding through hoping to buy his land cheap, Amos just smiled that slow, tired smile and said, "Boys, you can't buy what you never bothered to see." He didn't hoard his wealth. Instead, he sold the water, steady and fair, never more than folks could pay, never less than it was worth. He built schools for the children of those who'd stayed, gave seed to farmers who'd lost it in the drought.
When asked why, he'd then say, "I ain't selling water, I'm selling time." And maybe that what wealth truly is, time enough to live right. By the time Amos was old and gay, he was known as the quiet banker. No one remembered the man who'd failed back east. They knew the legend, the one who'd found gold beneath the dust without dead touching a pickaxe. His journals, filled with notes on soil, wind, and patience, became known in the reddened ledger passed down like scripture among the settlers who came after. There's an entry in that ledger near the end, scrawled in shaky hand, that sums up his creed. Money like a horse, feed it right, ride it steady, and it'll take you home. But chase it too hard, and you'll die thirsty in the desert. The last folks who saw him said he'd built himself a porch looking west, where the sun melted into his land like fire in a pan.
He'd sit there humming low whittling wood, and when asked what he was doing, he'd say, counting profits. If you look close, there weren't no coins or bills in sight, just the steady ripple of wheat in the wind and a man smiling like he'd beaten the world without fighting it. They found him one morning with that same smile still on his face, hat tipped low, a journal open on his knee. The last line read, "If a man can die at peace with the dirt that raised him, he richer than kings." They buried him right there on that porch under the tree that grown from the first mesquite he'd planted. When the wind blows through that valley now, it hums soft, even endless. Some say it just the branches, others say it Amos, still teaching those who listen how to hear the rhythm beneath the dust. And if you will find yourself driving through the western plains at dusk, you might spot that porch, or what left of it, silhouetted against the glow. Pull over, sit a while, listen, you'll hear the truth he left behind. That wealth ain't something you hold.
We some poor fish can't hear you.
Che altro offende la sentenne di cazzo going out and be going down the wood around.
Earl Breed or so long after Amos Redden's time in that valley he'd raised from dust to into something of a legend.
Folks all read and rest not that he slept there because everything within its reach seemed to settle. Crops grew even when the weather turned cruel. Folks lived longer, laughed easier, and even the wild horses grazed calmer. If the land itself remembered the man who'd once listened to it. Travelers who passed through would swear the air there had a weight to it, not heavy, but full of patience, full of stories whispered in the sound of wheat rustling across the plain. One of those travelers was a young man named Eli Mercer. He'd come from the far south, where the rivers dried up and the jobs went with him. He carried nothing but a busted sachet, a harmonica, and a debt that bought him across state lines if he let it.
Other could have read and rest from a preacher at a roadside chapel, who spoke of it like it was heaven itself, a place where the land gave back what a man was willing to earn. You've got patience in your bones, the preacher had said. That dirt will test it, and if it likes you, it'll reward you.
Eli didn't know if he believed in land liking a man, but he believed in second chance, and that was enough. He arrived one spring morning when the sky looked like poured milk and the wind smelled of mesquite and rain. The first thing he noted was how quiet it was. Not empty quiet, alive quiet, the kind of quiet way even your heartbeat feels like part of the music. He found work quick enough, fixing fences and hauling water for a family who lived near the edge of the old Redden property. They told him stories about Amos, about how he built the place not with greed but with rhythm, listening, waiting, understanding. Eli didn't say much.
Peggy nodded, Mrs. Peg, and spent his night sitting under the same stars Amos once had, humming to himself, feeling the pull of that same stillness. But the more he worked, the more he began to notice something. Every time he dug post hopes, the ground had a pulse. When he rested his hand against it, he could feel the faintest thrum, like the world breathing beneath him. At first he thought it was just his imagination, or maybe a trick of the wind. But the feeling never left. Weeks turned into months, and that hum in the earth began to talk to him in ways he couldn't rightly explain. When he was tired or rushing, the host came out crooked, the boards wouldn't hold, and the fences fell within a week. But when he slowed down, when he took his time, matched his breath to the rhythm of the soil, everything fit perfectly. He started telling at most feet. Folks laughed when he said it, but his fences never broke again. Soon the neighbors took notice. Crops grew better where Eli worked. Wells ran clearer.
One old woman swore the air itself felt cleaner after he'd spent a week mending her irrigation line. They began to say the boy had Redden touch, but Eli would just smile, shake his head, and say, "Nah, ma'am, I dare listen better than most." One evening, while sitting on the porch of the old homestead and half swallowed by vines, he found a small wooden box under a loose floorboard. Inside were pages from what looked like Amos' original ledger. The ink was faded, the pages brittle, but one line was still clear. It's sunrise. Patience ain't waiting for the world to move, it moving with it slow enough to stay in step. That line hit Eli deep. He realized then that what Amos had done wasn't about luck or land or money, it was about rhythm. The same rhythm that kept the rain coming, that turned seeds into stalks, that let a man grow into something stronger than his mistakes. From that day on, Eli stopped thinking of himself as just a worker. He started studying the land the way Amos once had. He mapped wind currents, tracked shadows, listened to the hum in the water veins. Eli's how he lived with charm, but he didn't have the wind currents, tracked shadows, listened to the hum in the water veins.
And after a few years, when he'd saved up enough, he bought a patch of dead ground east of town, hard cracked, good for nothing by anyone out reckoning.
The locals told him he was throwing money into the dirt.
He just smiled and said, "Guess we'll see which one more stubborn, me or the dust." For 5 years he worked that land alone, sunrise to sundown through drought and hail and loneliness. He planted small, tended smaller, waiting for the rhythm to speak. But speak it did. First came grass where there'd been none, then wildflowers, then a steady trickle of water from a place he dug on instinct. That trickle turned into a stream, and by the 10th year, the barren ground had turned green again. Redden rest had found its X. Word spread, same way it always does. Farmers who'd given up their land came back. Families settled again, and Eli, quiet-eyed the man before him, helped them build. Not by preaching, not by selling, but by teaching them how to listen. He'd walk out into a field, lead, press his hand into the soil and wait, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. They say near the end of his life, Eli sat by the same porch where he'd found that old ledger, strumming his harmonica as the wind rolled through the valley. Someone asked him once if he'd finally found peace. He chuckled low, eyes half closed, and said, "Peace? No. Peace don't come to a man. He gotta build it, one patient day at a time." When he passed, they buried him beside Amos Redden under that same mesquite tree. And now, when the wind passes through the leaves, folks swear it hums a little softer, a little warmer, like two old friends still talking about the rhythm of the world, long after they've both gone quiet. And maybe that's how all wealth is meant to end. Not with noise, not with power, but with a sound so steady it becomes part of the wind itself. The kind of wealth you can't count or hold only here, if you've got the heart for it. The story of Amos and Eli drifted far beyond that valley, carried in wagons and letters in the quiet tongues of travelers passing through. Became a kind of creed among wanderers and builders alike. A whisper that a man's true fortune wasn't in what he found, but in what he grew. Years later, long after Eli Mercer's bones had joined the dust, another soul came wandering westward, a young woman named June Calloway. She wasn't born of that land, but she carried its signs of silence, one that hides a storm of purpose. June had come from the rail towns back east, where the noise never stopped and the lights drowned out the stars. Her father had been a machinist, her mother a seamstress, and both of them died with calluses on their hands and worry in their hearts. They'd taught her one thing before they left this world: earn honest, keep steady. But in the cities, honesty didn't keep food on the table, so June worked the trains, accounting, tallies, schedules. Her job was to keep numbers neat, but the people around her weren't. She watched as companies rose and fell, fortunes made and lost in a single breath of speculation. Every year the faces changed, but the noise stayed the same. Men talking faster than they thought, spending faster than they earned. When a crash came, a bad one, June lost her work, her savings, and nearly her faith. She remembered something an old drifter had once told her while she was toting ledger books across the station yard. The city'll pay you to forget yourself. The land'll pay you to remember. At the time she'd laughed, but now sitting on a train she couldn't afford to the middle of nowhere, that line wouldn't leave her head. She stepped off in a town dodged Stillwater, no more than a cluster of wooden roofs under a restless sky. The first breath she looked there felt like something she'd been missing her whole life. Dust and air, raw and real. There was a poster nailed outside the depot. Workers needed, Red and Rest Cooperative. She didn't know what that meant, but she followed the dirt road out of town till the land began to change. The golden fields rolled like sleeping seas, and there, just past a line of mesquite, she saw it. A weather sign with the old words carved deep, Red and Rest. She was greeted by the descendants of those who'd stayed, families still living by the rhythm Amos and Eli had left behind. They weren't rich by city standards, but their lives had a weight that gold couldn't measure. They taught her how to self-womazingen,
savings, and she saw something beautiful in their pattern. One evening, sitting by the fire, she said to the old cooper, "You know, you're richer than any man I met in the city." They chuckled. "How that, missy? We ain't got much coin. We've got equity," she said smoothly. "The kind that don't rust, the kind that don't need banks to hold it. That wet would spread like wildfire through the valley. Not the kind Wall Street used, but the kind Amos would have smiled at. The kind built on fairness, patience, and the weight of one good deed rolling into another."
June began teaching the children numbers, not for profit, but for stewardship. A number of a seed, she'd say, you can plant it for yourself or for everyone. She started keeping ledgers the way Amos had, though hers were bound in cloth and filled with ink darker than midnight. She called it the ledger of time, and each page told the story of give and take, not debts, but balances. A sack of grain lent, a tool shared, a kindness repaid. By her third year, the ledger had turned into something more than a record. It was a guide. Folks started using it to trade without money, to build without borrow, and if we'll tend the same field. June said, we'll never go hungry alone. Her way of reckoning caught on fast. Neighboring towns, broken by drought and bad deals, sent riders to learn her system. She'd sit them down by the fire and say, I ain't no banker, I'm just counting what already counts. Within a decade, half the western counties had adopted her method, what folks started calling red and trade. It was simple. Your worth wasn't in your wealth, but in how much you made others worth something. And wouldn't you know it, businessmen from the city started coming too. They saw the prosperity spreading, and they wanted a piece. They tried to buy the land, patent the system, and even trademark the Redden name. But June met Emma the same way Amos would have, with a quiet grin and a steady tone. You can't buy rhythm, gentlemen, she'd tell them. You can't only learn to move with it. One night, one of those fancy men, a railroad investor with hands too clean for dirt, asked her what made Red and Rest so successful. She thought for a long while before answering it. Simple, she said. We measure value by how well something endures. Your kind measures it by how fast it grows. He left the next morning without saying another word. By the time June grew old, the valley had become a beacon of steadiness in a world that still ran too fast. Her students carried her ledgers to towns she'd never seen, building small co-ops, seed banks, and trade circles that outlasted empires. And when she passed, the people buried her beside the others under that same mesquite tree where patience had once turned to water. They say that when it rains now, the droplets fall softer there. Do if the clouds remember every name etched beneath that tree. Amos, Eli, June, 3 keepers of rhythm, 3 hands on the same beat, each teaching the next that true wealth ain't loud, it's quiet, deliberate, and meant to be shared. And if you'll find yourself out west when the storm breaks dead right, you might hear it too. That low hum between thunder and earth, singing a tune older than any coin, the song of worth measured not in gold but in grace. Years faded at brush lines in a forgotten painting, and Stillwater grew into more than a dot on a map. It became a living memory, a whisper of rhythm that spread through generations like wind through wheat. They catered the circle, that quiet way of doing business June had set down. No contracts, no greed, just balanced work and the trust of a handshake. Travelers who came from faraway cities didn't understand it. They saw no banks, no stock house, no shiny buildings with glass that reached the sky. Yet somehow, no man went hungry and no woman needed to beg. One of those travelers was a man named Isaac Crane, name that didn't mean much when he first arrived, but would come to rest in the pages of the next chapter. The land chose to write. Isaac was no wanderer by blood. He was a city man, born and raised where the ground was paved and the stars were stories told to children. He'd been a broker once, sharp and clean-cut, the kind who could smell profit the way a wolf smells blood. But when the markets turned and the rich turned meaner, Isaac lost more than his wealth. He lost the part of himself that believed in people. He'd made one too many deals that cost others their peace, and though his wallet swelled, his heart thinned out until even his own reflection looked hollow. When his firm folded and the letters of repossession came, he left without a goodbye, walked west with a mind full of noise and a soul in need of silence. When he reached Stillwater, it was by accident. His horse had gone lame, and the sun was setting in a way that made the dust glow like an embered sea. He followed the sound of laughter, real laughter, not the kind that hides despair, and found himself among folks mending fences and raking breads, if they had all the time in the world. The young boy offered him a seat by the fire, and when Isaac asked who ran the place, the boy simply said, "Nobody runs it. We're to keep it going." Those words struck him strange. In the city, every man was running something, a company, a racket, a game. But Head, they weren't running, they were living. He stayed for supper, quiet but listening. The talk was slow and thoughtful, like the land itself. They spoke of harvests, of rains that hadn't come yet, but would, of a new child born that week. Nobody spoke of profits, yet everything they said felt richer than any boardroom Isaac had they'd stepped into. That night, an old farmer knit his silence and said, "City took something from you, didn't it?" Isaac nodded. "Everything?" The farmer smiled, his face a map of wrinkles carved by sun and laughter. "Then maybe you'll learn how to earn it back the right way." Isaac didn't sleep much. The wind hummed soft against the eaves, the same steady rhythm Amos had once heard, and it stirred something in him, a feeling he hadn't known since boyhood. The next morning, he asked if he could work. They gave him a shovel, pointed him toward a field, and said, "Start with what you can carry." And he did. At first, his hands blistered and bled, his back ached. His city skin wasn't made for the sun or the soil. But the days turned to weeks, and the rhythm of his labor matched the hum of the earth. Something changed. The noise in his mind began to fade. The greed, the guilt, the endless calculation of worth, they all loosened their grip. He learned that the land didn't care what he'd lost. It only cared what he gave. By winter, he'd built a small cabin at the edge of town, nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, and a porch that faced the sunrise. Every morning he'd sit there with a cup of bitter coffee, watching the light creep across the fields. He started keeping notes again, the way men like him always did. But these weren't market figures or projections. They were reflections, lessons. The value of a thing grows with the time you give it. The world doesn't owe you yield. It offers you rhythm. Profit is what left when patience has done its work. Those words filled his journal like seeds, each one sprouting into the man he was meant to become. He started helping the younger folk with numbers, teaching them how to balance trade without losing trust. And soon enough, he saw what June had seen, what Amos had heard, the hum of prosperity that wasn't loud but sure. Years later, when storms tore through the region and crops failed across half the state, Stillwater held strong. Isaac had taught the folks how to build reserves, how to treat every good year like borrowed grace. When others panicked, they shared. When others sold, they waited. And when the storms passed, the town was still standing, because its wealth wasn't in barns or banks, but in bonds between people. They thought Isaac the keeper, though he never claimed to own a thing. He was the Agnellas and had golden space, not power. When he grew old, much like Amos and June before him, he spent his last days on that porch, writing by lantern light while the rain whispered on the roof. The townsfolk found him one dawn, his pen falling to his lap, the last word still wet on the page. Wealth is the aid of patience. Lose one, and you'll never find the other. They buried him beside the others under that same mesquite tree, its roots now thick and wide, drinking from the same water vein Amos had once found. And if you were to stand there on a quiet night, when the crickets fall still and the rain begins to patter, you'd swear the air carries a sound, not mournful, not gone, but alive. A slow, steady hum, the kind that means the earth remembers. That's the song of the Redden Valley now. Not one of riches, but of rhythm. Not of gain, but of grace. And somewhere in that melody lies the truest kind of wealth a man peace earned, not by chasing the world, but by letting it finally catch up to him. When Isaac Crane's story faded into legend, Stillwater settled into a calm kind of glory, the kind that doesn't shout its name, but hums it, soft and steady, in the bones of everyone who calls it home. Time moved with the slow turn of a wagon wheel, the old gave way to the young, and yet the rhythm of the land never changed. Folks said that every 100 years, the earth there chose a new keeper, a soul who understood that wealth wasn't something you hoarded, but something you harmonized with. The next keeper didn't arrive on horseback or in boots caked with trail dust. He came in a worn-down pickup, rattling like a tin can full of memories. His name was Sam Grady, a mechanic by trade, though he carried the heart of a dreamer. He'd grown on fixing engines in a town that forgot how to breathe. Everything there was run by speed-faster cars, faster money, faster failure. Sam had spent his life listening to the growl of machines, but one night he realized he couldn't hear himself thin over all the noise.
So he shut down his shop, packed up what little he had, and followed a road that seemed to whisper, "Slow down, son. You've been running too long." The road led him straight into Stillwater. By then, the town wasn't much to look at from the outside. Half the buildings leaned like old men, and the main road was more dust than dirt. But the people still carried that same calm light in their eyes. Sam pulled into the general store and asked that a man could find work. The woman behind the counter just smiled and said, "Work finds you here if you're worth listening to." That first week, he helped mend a generator, then a windmill, then a pump out by the co-op well. He didn't charge much, and when folks tried to pay him extra, he shook his head. "Just let it stay a while," he'd say. And stay he did. He came to love the silence between the sounds. The wind over wheat, the creak of porch boards, the lazy bark of a dog watching clouds go by. The land had a way of speaking that no engine could. It wasn't built to run fast. Lee found himself trying. He shut down his shop, packed up what little he had, and followed a road that seemed to whisper, "Slow down, son. You've been running too long." The road led him straight into Stillwater. By then, the town wasn't much to look at from the outside. Half the buildings leaned like old men, and the main road was more dust than dirt, but the people still carried that same calm light in their eyes. Sam pulled into the general store and asked that a man could find work. The woman behind the counter just smiled and said, "Work finds you here if you're worth listening to." That first week, he helped mend a generator, then a windmill, then a pump out by the co-op well. He didn't charge much, and when folks tried to pay him extra, he shook his head. "Just let it stay a while," he'd say, and stay he did. He came to love the silence between the sounds, the wind over wheat, the creak of porch boards, the lazy bark of a dog watching clouds go by. The land had a way of speaking that no engine could. It wasn't built to run fast.
It was built to last. But Sam wasn't just a drifter looking for peace. He had a mind that tinkered with more than bolts and belts. He started helping the Coke folks keep their machinery running smooth, then helped them build new tools from old scrap. Before long, he'd rigged up water collectors, solar rigs, even a wind battery or two. Nothing fancy, fit enough to make life easier. One night, sitting by the fire outside his workshop, he told the mayor, You don't need to outrun the world, but you gotta make sure it doesn't outrun your purpose. The mayor nodded slow, puffing on his pipe. And what's your purpose, Sam? Sam looked out at the stars, the same ones Amos Redden once stared at when he was still learning to trust the rhythm of the earth. Same yours, he said, keeping the hum alive. Word of Stillwater quiet prosperity started to spread again. Young folks came from the cities, tired of chasing hours in debt. They locked their gadgets and their screens, but the land taught them patience like it always did. Sam didn't turn them away. He showed them how to wire the solar rigs right, how to patch engines, how to fix with care instead of hurry. One day a college kid asked him, "Mr. Grady, how do you know all this stuff?" Sam just smiled, his hands black with grease. Ain't about knowing, son. It's about listening. Same rule for people, machines, and money. You listen long enough, they'll tell you how they want to work. It wasn't long before Stillwater started building again, not skyscrapers or factories, but workshops and garns and wind farms that hummed in harmony with the plains. The old rhythm had found its new instrument technology that served patience instead of pride. Sam kept his records too, like those who came before him. Only his ledger wasn't ink and paper. It was a collection of notes scratched on oil-stained pages and taped to his shop wall. Quotes, reminders, little pieces of truth that came to him while fixing or thinking. Folks would come by just to read them. Some were simple, others deep like canyon wells. Don't race the rain, just make sure your roof red. Progress ain't speed, it's sustainability. You can't fix what you don't respect. Before long, people started calling him the mechanic of the plains, but Sam never thought of himself that way. I'm no mechanic, he'd say. I'm just a man making things hum. Then one summer, a big storm rolled through, one that threatened to tear the town apart. Lightning split the hills, winds howled fierce, and for a while, it seemed that Stillwater might fall. But the windmills held, the pump stayed strong, and every home kept its lights. When the storm passed, Sam stood on the porch of his shop, rain-soaked and smiling, whispering into the wind, "Amos, you old devil, your rhythm's still holding." He lived another decade after that, spending his evenings teaching whoever would listen how to fix more than just machines. He'd say, "Ain't no part worth replacing if the soul's still good." That goes for engines and folks alike. When he passed, they found a small note on his workbench written in grease pencil, smudged but clear, "Keep it humming. Don't let the noise win." They buried him next to the others under that widening mesquite, where the wind and the earth still whispered in tune.
And so the rhythm of Redden rest carried on across centuries, across faces, across every soul who learned that wealth, true wealth, don't come from owning but from understanding. To this day, travelers who wander through Stillwater say they can feel it, the hum under their boots, the soft song in the wind. Some call it the spirit of patience. Others say it's just the sound of the land breathing. But those who've stayed long enough know better. It's not a sound you hear, it's a sound you become. Years rolled on, and the story of Stillwater became less a tale and more a presence, a quiet murmur carried through generations like a hymn half remembered but never quite forgotten. The children of those plains grew up hearing about Amos Redden, June Calloway, Isaac Crane, and Sam Grady. Each one had walked the same dirt, faced the same sun, and left behind the same lesson in a different shape. Patience pays better than gold. By the time the next keeper came around, the world had gone full circle. Machines smaller than books, money that didn't clink or crinkle but blinked in blue light, and voices talking more to glass screens than to each other.
The cities had become louder, the air thicker, and the pace faster than then before. But Stillwater, bless its stubborn soul, stayed slow. Her name was Clara Dunn, and she was born in Stillwater, but raised in the sprawl of neon and noise. Her daddy used to tell her stories about the land, how it whispered to those who worked it, how folks there didn't lie even, they made a lie. But like most young ones, she'd shrugged it off, thinking he was just another old romantic who'd never caught up with the times. Clara made her fortune early, working in tech finance. She was sharp at attack, good with numbers, and even better with people. She built her own startup by 30, sold it by 32, and retired by 35 with more money than she'd know what to do with. The kind of success most folks dream about. And yet, the more zeros appeared in her account, the emptier she felt inside. Her father died one spring. She came back to Stillwater for the funeral, and that when the silence hit her. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the kind that listens back. She stood by that old mesquite tree, her heels sinking into the soft earth, looking at the names carved into its bark mows, Eli, June, Isaac, Sam, and she felt something she hadn't in years. Small, not insignificant, but part of something bigger. The old townsfolk still remembered her family. They spoke her father's name with respect, not for the money he'd sent home, but for the time he gave when he could. She found herself sitting on the porch of his old house, now covered in ivy, watching the sunset turn the fields to fire. Somewhere out there, a windmill creaked the way it had for generations. The sound was steady, honest. That night, she pulled out her phone, trying to work like she always did, but the signal was weak. She laughed. First time she'd laughed in months. With nothing better to do, she went rummaging through her father's old desk and found a leather-bound book with a title pressed into its cover, The Ledger of Time. It wasn't the original, but a newer one, a continuation of June. Each generation had added to it, and Clara found her father's handwriting near the back. Notes, reminders, bits of wisdom. Never forget, the land ledger always balances, even when yours don't. Don't fix what time's still teaching you to understand. There were names and trades too. Grain for honey, repairs for schooling, water for tools. The system still worked, not with banks or currency, but with trust. She spent the next few days just reading. The longer she read, the slower her thoughts became. It was like her heartbeat had matched the hum of the place. By the 5th day, she made a decision that would have sounded crazy to anyone back in the city. She stayed. At first, the town didn't know what to make of her. Fancy clothes, a car that looked like it belonged in another century, hands too soft for work, but Clara wasn't afraid to learn. She joined the co-op, helped run their numbers, modernized their trades just enough to connect them without drowning them in screens. She used her tech know-how to build a simple platform called the Circle Ledger, a digital version of June's system. It wasn't about profit, it was about proof that the same values could thrive in a new world. Her program wasn't flashy, just clean, simple, transparent way. Anyone would see who gave, who helped, who shared. It wasn't about currency, it was about community. And for the first time in decades, Stillwater Reach spread far beyond its valley. Other small towns joined in, farmers in Kansas, ranchers in Wyoming, fishermen in Oregon. They linked up through Clara's Circle, each one trading and sharing without Ed touching a dollar. But without good things, the big players came sniffing around soon enough. Corcoran wanted to buy it, slap their logo on it, charge fees for premium community access. Clara refused every up. When one executive asked her what her exit tab was, she smiled slow and said, "Honey, my lead to never exit." That ruffled more than a few feathers. Lawsuits came, offers doubled, threats whispered, but Stillwater stood behind her. They didn't just protect her, they believed in her. For the first time, technology bowed to the rhythm of the land instead of raking it. Years passed. Clara grew older, but the circle grew stronger. When economic crashes hit the world, then digital markets, crypto collapses, automated layoffs, the folks in Stillwater didn't flinch. Their lights stayed on, their tables stayed full, and their ledger stayed balanced. One night, a young reporter from New York came to interview her. He was curious how a dusty old town in the middle of nowhere had outlasted billion-dollar banks. Clara poured him a coffee and said, "Because we never let numbers outrun their meaning." The boy looked confused. "Meaning?" She leaned forward, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "You city folks count what you measure. We measure what we can keep." When she passed, she left behind more than a program. She left behind proof. Proof that wealth, no matter how digital or distant the world got, still came down to time, trust, and temperance. They buried her beneath that same mesquite tree, its roots stretching wider than any data network, drinking from the same well of patience. And when it rained that night, folks swore the thunder carried her voice soft, steady, unbroken. Keep the circle unbroken and it'll keep you. Long after Clara done passing, the world kept changing faster and stranger than then. Machines started talking to each other more than people did, and the sky was full of metal birds humming their restless tunes.
One night, a young reporter from New York came to interview her. He was curious how a dusty old town in the middle of nowhere had outlasted billion-dollar banks. Clara poured him a coffee and said, "Because we never let numbers outrun their meaning." The boy looked confused. "Meaning?" She leaned forward, her eyes glinting in the firelight. "You city folks count what you measure. We measure what we can keep." When she passed, she left behind more than a program. She left behind proof. Proof that wealth, no matter how digital or distant the world got, still came down to time, trust, and temperance. They buried her beneath that same mesquite tree, its roots stretching wider than any data network, drinking from the same well of patience. And when it rained that night, folks swore the thunder carried her voice soft, steady, unbroken. Keep the circle unbroken, and it'll keep you. Long after Clara done passing, the world kept changing faster and stranger than then. Machines started talking to each other more than people did, and the sky was full of metal birds humming their restless tunes.
One night, a young reporter from New York came to interview her. He was curious how a dusty old town in the middle of nowhere had outlasted billion-dollar banks. Clara poured him a coffee and said, because we never let numbers outrun their meaning. The boy looked confused. Meaning? She leaned forward, her eyes glinting in the firelight. You city folks count what you measure. We measure what we can keep. When she passed, she left behind more than a program. She left behind proof that wealth, no matter how digital or distant the world got, still came down to time, trust, and temperance. They buried her beneath that same mesquite tree, its roots stretching wider than any data network, drinking from the same well of patience. And when it rained that night, folks swore the thunder carried her voice, soft, steady, unbroken. Keep the circle unbroken, and it'll keep you. Long after Clara done passing, the world kept changing faster and stranger than end. Machines started talking to each other more than people did, and the sky was full of metal birds humming their restless tunes. Most folks drifted deeper into the noise screens glowing brighter than stars. Fortunes built on nothing but numbers floating through the air. Yet somehow, Stillwater stayed quiet, like an island anchored in the storm. The circle ledger still ticked along, slow and steady, its heartbeat now woven into the rhythm of the plains. But every generation has its reckoning. The year the drought came, the sun burned harder than any man could remember. Fields turned brittle, rivers shrank into cracked ribbons of dust, and the hum that once carried through Stillwater began to falter. For the first time in 200 years, folks started to worry that maybe the land had finally given all it had to give. That when Eli Crane rode back into town. He wasn't kin to Isaac by blood, just by spirit. A wanderer with more scars than savings and eyes that carried the sage stubborn light Amos once had when he struck his first deal with the earth. Eli was a prospector of sorts, though not for gold or oil. He chased what he called lost purpose, worked odd jobs, fixed engines, mended fences, and listened to folks talk about what they'd lost to time. Said he could smell forgotten value in the air, like rain before a storm. When he came to Stillwater, he'd been following stories of a town that traded without taking, built without raking, and lived without losing itself. But what he found was a tired version of that legend. That place saved hope had gone quiet. He stayed at the old inn by the creek, the one Sam Grady apprentices had built from reclaimed timber. The walls still smelled of dust and cedar. The first night, he walked down to the well by the mesquite tree and laid his hand on its stone rim. The ground was dry, but he could feel a pulse beneath it, faint, like a buried drum. The next morning, he went to the co-op meeting. The folks were arguing about rain, about water rights, about whether to sell off part of the land to a city investor who promised desalination rigs and energy credits. Eli listened without speaking till they'd worn themselves tired. Then he leaned forward and said, "You seen a man sell his horse 'cause he thought the saddle was worth more?" The room went still. "Water don't come from money," he said, "and neither does life. You sell your ground, you sell your hum." They didn't take kindly to outsiders telling how to live, but his voice had that slow certainty, like the land itself was speaking through him. A few of the elders recognized something in his tone, something old, something real, and they let him stay. He started walking the edges of the valley each dawn, dragging a long metal rod through the dirt, listening for echoes. "I ain't digging for water," he said when someone asked. "I'm digging for memory." After weeks of walking and listening, he found it an old irrigation tunnel built in Isaac time, sealed off and forgotten. The wood had rotted, but the structure held, and behind it, a trickle of groundwater still ran cold and pure. With the townsfolk help, he cleared it out, patched it up, and brought the flow back to the fields. When the first shoots of green rode again from the dusk, the people left round silent. Eli tipped his hat and said, "Land don't quit on you till you quit on it." But his work didn't stop there. He started visiting every homestead, every family, asking what they'd been holding on to that they'd stopped using. Tools rusted in barns, books left unread, dreams shelved away when the drought hit. He heeded restaurant circulation. Gliz's same principle Clara had built the circle ledger on, only now it wasn't digital, it was human again. He fixed broken windmills, traded stories for repairs, taught the kids to mend instead of replace. Soon enough, the town started humming again, not loud, not proud, but alive. One evening, sitting by the fire near the co-op, a young woman asked him, "Eli, why do you do all this? You could have gone anywhere." He smiled into the flames. "Because I heard about a place with wealth. Wasn't noise. I came to see if it was still singing." The girl frowned. "And is it?" Eli poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks into the night. "Barely," he said. But she breathed, and along in their breath, their song. The drought broke that winter. The rains came slow at first, then steady, then strong enough to flood the lower fields. Folks rebuilt, resowed, relearned. The hum returned deeper, wiser, like a melody carried through every root, every rusted hinge, every drop of work-worn sweat. Eli never had himself a leader, but when people started asking for guidance, he didn't refuse. He'd sit under the mesquite and tell them stories, not sermons. And I told him, no. The drought broke that winter. The rains came slow at first, then steady, then strong enough to flood the lower fields. Folks rebuilt, resowed, relearned. The hum returned deeper, wiser, like a melody carried through every root, every rusted hinge, every drop of work-worn sweat. Eli never had himself a leader, but when people started asking for guidance, he didn't refuse. He'd sit under the mesquite and tell them stories, not sermons, the truths dressed in dust. The land don't pay by the hour, he'd say. It pays by the season, by the soul. If you're patient enough, it pays in peace. He wrote nothing down, but others did. They filled notebooks and recorded his words, his parables, his quiet pauses between them. They said his voice carried like a low thunder, soft but steady. When his time came, he didn't die in bed. He rode out to the ridge at dawn, wedged the horizon, met the sky like two old friends, and he never came back. They found his hat a week later, caught on the branch of a sage bush, and beneath it, a small carving in the stone. If the hum stops, it guess you stopped listening. That night it rained again, and the hum carried on through the water, through the wind, through every soul still willing to believe that patience and purpose could outlast every storm this world could conjure. Stillwater lived on not at a place, but at a promise. A song that keeps singing long after the singer gone.
Years passed into decades, and Stillwater slipped quiet again, not forgotten, but folded gently into the soft corners of memory. Travelers still came now and then, drawn by whispers of a town that never fell to greed or time, but fewer stayed. The world beyond had grown so loud that most folks couldn't hear the hum anymore, even if they stood right on top of it. Progress had turned into something slick and weight-leads, numbers moving faster than the wind used to blow, but down the plains still breathed slow. Another story was starting. It began with a man named Tom Whitlock.
Folks called him Tin Cup Tom because he always carried an old dented mug hanging off his belt loop saying coffee tasted better when it came from something imperfect. He was a wanderer too, though not the lost kind, more like a man looking for proof that the old ways hadn't died completely. Tom had been born in a city that measured worth by the hour. He worked in a glass tower, trading digital credits and watching numbers flicker green or red on screens bigger than church windows. One day, after years of watching other men's fortunes rise and fall like tides, he realized he couldn't tell anymore whether he was rich or just numb. That night, sitting in his tiny apartment, he read a quote scrawled on an old message board. If the hum stops, it kills you stop listening. Something about that line struck him deep, like a bell ringing in the marrow. He started digging, and after weeks of chasing fragments of stories and scattered records, he found mention of Stillwater. No map marked it, no road led straight there. But Tom had time, and for the first time in his life, he had reason. Sold everything except his pickup, that tin cup, and a notebook filled with quotes he didn't yet understand. Then he drove. Took him weeks, maybe months. He stopped keeping track. But one morning, the horizon broke into wide gold plains, and he saw it. At a town small enough to miss if you blinked, yet it carried that feeling of belonging. The sign at the edge read simply, Stillwater, Pop Hummer. The first person he met was a boy fixing a fence by the side of the road. Couldn't have been older than 16, freckles speckled like sand, humming a tune that carried through the dry air. Tom rolled down his window and asked, "That the hum everyone keeps talking about?" The boy grinned. "Nah, sir, that's just me keeping rhythm while I work. The hum quieter than that. You'll feel it when you stop trying to find it." Tom parked his truck near the general store, same one that stood since Amos Redden time, though now its windows glowed faintly with solar panels lining the roof. Inside, a woman named Ruth ran the place, sharp-eyed, warm-hearted, the kind of person who didn't waste words but didn't let silence feel heavy, neither. "You're looking for something," she said, not that a question. Tom nodded. A sound. Ruth smiled slow. "Then you're in the right place. Most come made looking for answers. You'll find patience first." He stayed the night at the co-op bunkhouse. The next morning, he watched the town wake up, folks moving with purpose, not hurry. There were no bosses, no shift bells, no sense of rushing toward anything. Yet everything got done. He started lending a hand when he could, fixing fences, helping haul grains, mending old machines that had long outlived their factory dates. He had the mind of a trader, so naturally he started thinking in balance sheets. But when he tried to talk to the co-op about profit margins, old Ruth laughed. "Profit," she said. "Son, the only margin worth minding round here is the one between sunrise and sunset." That night, Tom sat by the well under the mesquite tree, the same tree that had outlived generations. The bark was scarred with names, initials, dates. Traced his fingers over one that read E. Crane, then another lower down, C. Dunn. He realized he wasn't looking at history, he was touching continuity. He started writing in his notebook again, not numbers this time, but lessons. Things the land whispered when he listened hard enough. Ain't no such thing as passive income when your hands ain't dirty. Growth ain't about getting bigger. The future a fool gold did forgets his water came from weeks turned into months. Townsfolk grew used to him, though they teased him for his city ways. He didn't mind, he felt lighter than he had in years. But it wasn't until a new storm rolled through, a fierce one, the van that tests those timber and soul, that Tom truly understood what Stillwater meant. Lightning tore through the hills, thunder like fouled hooves. One of the solar rigs caught fire and the pumps threatened to fail. Without hesitation, everyone in town ran when the danger, not away. Tom found himself alongside them, his hands blistered and bleeding, fighting wind and rain to keep the generators covered. When the storm finally passed, the town stood drenched but unbroken. In the quiet after, someone started humming. Then another joined, and another till the air filled with that same low, steady sound he'd been chasing for months. It wasn't a song, it was a heartbeat. Tom finally smiled, eyes closed, whispering to himself, "There it is." He stayed in Stillwater after that, not that a visitor, not that a convert, but that a bridge. He started helping other towns learn the ways of the circle, how to build community economies, how to trade without taking. He'd travel for weeks teaching, then always come back to that quiet little valley where the hum never died. By the time he was old, the world outside had changed again, machines running everything, cities floating above clouds, but Stillwater stayed the same. The hum was still there, though fainter now, like a memory wrapped in mist. When Tom passed, they buried him beside the mesquite next to the others. His tin cup was hung from one of the lower branches, swaying in the breeze, catching rain, and when the wind blew through it just right, it made the softest sound, a faint ringing hum that carried across the fields. Folks said the land had taken it up again. One more note added to the eternal rhythm. Time rolled forward the way a lazy river does, slow, wide, but unstoppable. The hum of Stillwater carried on quieter maybe, but no less sure. Some said it could be heard only after midnight, when the world outside went still enough for truth to slip through. Others swore it wasn't sound at all, but a feeling, a pulse in the soil that let you know life here didn't bend to hurry or hunger. Then came the day when the hum met the stars. It started with a young woman named Elsie March. She was the great-granddaughter of one of the co-op founders, and though her folks kept the land, she'd gone off to study what they called astro-agriculture, growing food off-world. The kind of thing her granddad would have laughed at, saying can't plant roots where there ain't dirt. But Elsie was stubborn as the rest of them. She came back home one summer with eyes full of wonder and a head full of wild ideas. She'd seen things few folks from Stillwater Po imagined: cities floating on air, farms built inside glass domes on the moon, seeds that grew under starlight alone. Yet despite all that marvel, she said none of it felt alive. They've got yield, she told the co-op, but no hum. Her return stirred up talk gab. The old-timers were wary, thinking she'd come to turn Stillwater into another experiment. But Elsie didn't want to replace the old ways. She wanted to carry him higher. She spent her nights under the same mesquite tree where Clara and Eli had once sat, reading their stories, learning from the lines they'd left behind. One evening, while he was studying by lantern light, she heard the wind rattle the tin cup that hung from Tom Whitlock's branch. It made that faint chime, pure a memory, and she whispered to herself, maybe at time the hum traveled farther than we can walk. Her cred was simple but daring. Using a mix of modern tech and Stillwater wisdom, she wanted to build the first living satellite, a capsule filled with earth from the valley, seeds from its fields, and stories from its people. A time capsule let go, not jerks and rotten space. She heard it the hum keep. At first the town was split. Some saw it time blasphemy, sending sacred soil into the cold dark. Others saw it as a sign of trust that Stillwater hum could outlive its borders. Ruth's grandson, now the co-op head, finally settled it. If the hum true, he said, you'll carry wherever it needed, so they began. Folks from all around came to help, farmers, engineers, even a few scientists who'd grown tired of hollow progress. They didn't build it fat, they built it right. Every piece hand-forged, tested, blessed with patience. The project took 3 years. By the end, they had something beautiful. A gleaming silver vessel, though bigger than a barn door, lined inside with Stillwater clay and filled with the valley breath. Before they launched it, the town did one last time under the tree. Each person spoke a single word into a recorder, words that faith balanced together, and remember, those words were etched into the Humkeeper's surface by laser, faint enough to miss unless you knew where to look. The night of the launch was clear. The sky above Stillwater looked close enough to touch. As the rocket rose, a low rumble rolled through the ground, the kind that made the earth tremble like it was humming back in approval. The townsfolk watched until it was a star among stars. Then silence. For months after, life went back to its rhythm. Fields to tend, roofs to mend, ledgers to balance, but every now and then a shimmer passed through the air, a brief flicker in the lights, a pulse in the well water, a sense that the hum had grown wider. Years later, the Humkeeper made its orbit round the moon. The sensors caught something strange, tiny sprouts growing in Whately's soil. Impossible, the scientists said. But those who knew Stillwater just smiled. They thought it the green drift. Word spread fast, reaching corners of earth where hope had run dry. Soon, people started building their own hum garden, little patches of patience and purpose scattered across the globe. Cities started treading through new ledgers, inspired by the circle, not for money, but for good faith. For a time, the world remembered how to listen there. But Elsie, she wasn't done. She believed the hum could do more than that survive as it couldn't teach. So she traveled, speaking wherever folks would listen, telling stories of Clara, Eli, Tom, and then those who'd carried the torch before. Her words weren't grand, they were quiet truths. The hum ain't magic, she'd say, it's memory in motion. Every time someone waits instead of taking, every time they give instead of keeping, at the sound you're hearing. When she grew older, she came back to Stillwater. The town lived much the same, Wiser May, a bit more silver in its wood, but the heart was still there. She sat by the well again, under that same tree, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was reaching for the stars. She realized they'd already come down to meet her. That night, she wrote one last line in her journal, "The hum don't fade, it migrates." When she passed, they didn't bury her under the mesquite like the others. Instead, they mixed a handful of her ashes with the soil of the Humkeeper's second capsule, one that would join the first in orbit. As it launched, the town stood silent again, heads bowed not in grief, but in gratitude. And somewhere beyond the blue, two tiny patches of still water soil drifted side by side, humming together across eternity. The hum had found its et. Long after Elsie Humkeeper vanished beyond the clouds, Stillwater became something of a myth. Maps stopped showing it, satellites passed over without bothering to zoom in, and the cities grew so tall they forgot what horizon even meant. Folks spoke of it, it got old folk tale. The town that could make the earth sing. The people traded kindness like currency and lived slower than time itself. But myths, if told odd enough, got a way of calling back those who need 'em most. That how Jonah Pike came wandering through the dry stretches one spring morning. He wasn't a cowboy, though he wore the hat. Was not a preacher, though his words sometimes had the weight of one. He was what the world now called a salvager, someone who searched the forgotten corners for tech that still worked, digging through the ruins of the old digital age. The cities had burned through their own brilliance, left behind skeletons of neon and noise. Jonah had made a decent living piecing it back, fixing what others had given on. But lately, he'd started to feel it, that deep, hollow quiet that comes when success don't feel it's saving. He'd heard whispers of Stillwater while trading in the coast markets. A trader mentioned a town where folks used no banks, no power grids, no contracts, and yet no one went hungry. Jonah figured it was a lie or a cult, but the name stuck in his head like a burr. A month later, after his last salvage deal fell apart, he found himself driving toward the plains with nothing but his truck, his tools, and a nagging sense that he'd forgotten what peace sounded like. It took him 3 days to find it. Or it found him. The road disappeared into grassland so wide it looked like the world had exhaled. His truck sputtered, coughed, and died that as the sun dipped behind the horizon. He cursed, kicked the tire, then saw a faint light flickering in the distance. Walking toward it, he found himself standing before a windmill creaking in the evening breeze. Below where sat a woman in her 60s mending a lantern. Lost, she asked without looking up. Maybe, Jonah said, or maybe found. Hard to tell, she chuckled, slow and warm. Then halfway home. That was how Jonah met Mara Dunn, the caretaker of the town and distant kin to Clara herself. She led him down the dirt road toward Stillwater proper, its lanterns glowing soft against the dark. It was not much, no neon, no noise, just the hum steady at a heartbeat beneath his boots. He stayed for supper at the co-op hall. They served stew made from what they called circle crops, each ingredient part of a rotation that fed back into the soil. Folks talked easy on the fire, not about profits or markets, but about harvests and songs. It confused Jonah at first. He didn't understand how they survived without selling out to Ut Corporation, but no one seemed to worry about survival. They lived it like a fact, not a fight. After dinner, Mara showed him the circle ledger, not a tablet or a sur anymore, but a living archive carved into wood, stone, and copper plates. Every trade, every story, every lesson etched by hand. Ran his fingers across the names Clara, Eli, Tom, Elsie, all recorded in the same spiraling pattern. Yick the rings of a tree. Mara said softly, "We don't keep ledgers to count. We keep them to remember the rhythm." Jonah didn't sleep much that night. He sat outside, listening to the wind whisper through the fields. It wasn't silence, he said. It was stillness. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to fill it. In the morning, he walked to the edge of town where a handful of kids were working on a broken generator. It wasn't for power and screens. It ran the irrigation pumps. They were laughing, arguing, figuring it out without any adults stepping in. Jonah crouched beside them and showed him how to reroute the current, his hands moving by instinct. When the pump whirred to life, the youngest one grinned and said, "You either hum louder, mister." That got to him more than he cared to admit. He stayed longer than planned. A week turned to a month, and a month to a year. He helped fix windmills, build new water lines, and even taught the co-op how to repair solar rigs from scrap. In return, they taught him something. He'd forgotten that every tool, no matter how advanced, was owned they'd honest names the hands that held it. One evening, sitting under the mesquite that had outlived every generation, Jonah asked Mara, "You wonder what happens when the hum stops?" She smiled. "That's the trick, son. It don't stop. It finds a new body to breathe through." Used to be Clara, then Eli, then Tom, then Elsie. Now at whoever listening, he didn't say much after that, but that night when the wind rolled over the plains, it carried a faint metallic ring, his old wrench hanging beside Tom's tin cup, singing in the breeze. As the years went on, Jonah became Stillwater's next keeper of rhythm. He didn't lead, not like the others. He just fixed things, listened well, and taught anyone who asked that wealth ain't how much you've got. It how much keeps working after you're gone. When he finally passed, they didn't carve his name into stone. Instead, the kids he'd taught wired one of his old circuits into the co-op main board. Every time the pump started, it clicked once. A little echo, soft but steady. The people said it was the hum remembering him. And maybe was. Because years later, when the stars turned red and the world spun through another storm of greed and forgetting, travelers still found their way to Stillwater. And if they stood long enough by that old mesquite, they could hear it clear as day, the low, patient hum of other souls who'd come before, whispering through dusk and time, "Keep fixing, keep giving, keep humming." By the time the next century rolled, the world had turned itself inside out more than once. Cities rose in the clouds, machines learned to think, and money, whatever shape it did, became almost invisible. It hummed through networks now, silent and unseen, traded faster than thought. But speed, as it always does, came with a price. The faster things moved, the less anyone remembered what stillness felt like. Yet somewhere out there, buried beneath the noise and neon, stories of Stillwater persisted like seeds waiting on rain. The traders in Sky Market spoke of it with a half smile, a whisper, a place where folks still built things that lasted. A town with no borders, no banks, just a hum that never quit. And that how Levi Grant came to find that, or maybe to rebuild it. Levi wasn't born in a world that remembered soil. His generation lived in air colonies vast, floating platforms tethered by nothing but math and faith. He worked, dat, an ether broker, trading data streams for energy credits, watching the value of things shift by the second. But one day, he stumbled on an archived broadcast, an old story told in the voice of a gravel-throated man by a campfire, talking about a place that made the earth sing. That voice, that accent, it didn't sell him a bite, it invited him home. The story became an obsession. He played it on loop, those creaking words about Clara and Eli, about crops that grew slow and true, about the hum that kept the world from losing itself. And somewhere deep down, Levi realized something all their high-flying progress hadn't built anything real. It had just built noise. So he did something the colonies called foolish. He cashed out every credit, bought a drop shin, and set a course for where the coordinates used to be. It took him 6 days to descend. The lower atmosphere was wild and thick, full of storms and static. But when he finally broke through the clouds, he saw it green plains stretching out like memory, and right at the heart of it, a shimmering pattern, circular there, a ripple. He landed near what used to be the co-op, though most of it had sunk into the soil. The fields were empty, but the air carried a strange kind of humming, faint yet alive. Levi walked until his boots sank into the old dirt road. There, under the bent shadow of the mesquite, stood what looked like a monument, but it wasn't marble or metal. It was woven. Strands of copper, vine, and glass twisted together like roots. And at its center, hanging from the lowest branch, was a small tin cup, worn smooth by wind and time. He touched it, and the hum deepened, soft, resonant, like the land had recognized another wanderer. He spent the next week exploring the ruins. Most of the town had been swallowed by grass, but here and there traces remained. The circle ledger carved in stone, the remnants of solar rigs, the whisper of old trade songs carved into wood. Found the co-op bell, rusted half buried in a creek, and polished it clean. When he rang it, the sound rolled across the plains, deep and low. That night, camping beside the well, he felt something stir under the earth. The hum grew louder, like a heartbeat waking up after a long nap. He realized then that Stillwater wasn't that dead. It had gone quiet, waiting for someone to listen again. Levi didn't land to stay, but each sunrise pulled him deeper in. He started rebuilding, not with blueprints, but intuition. The hum guided him somehow. He'd test a line of irrigation, and the rhythm would quicken or soften, telling him when it was right. He built slow, learning that he went, and soon others found him. First came a pair of wandering engineers tired of running machines that didn't care who fed them. Then a nurse, a carpenter, a boy who played mute through broken speakers just to hear something human. They stayed because Stillwater asked for work, not worship. Levi taught him what he'd learned from the home. You build with purpose, not profit. The land remembers your hands. You share, for you need, you'll never need alone. And if you listen long enough, even silence will tell you what's wrong. Over time, they built what folks came to call Stillwater Reborn. Not a town, not a commune, just a rhythm made solid. Houses grew from reclaimed glass and bamboo, power from wind and warmth, trade from trust. The circle ledger came back, etched this time on recycled circuit boards, a marriage of past and progress. And though they used machines, they never let machines need them. At night, they'd gather round the old mesquite, playing soft music and telling stories about the ones who came before. Levi would listen, eyes half closed, imagining Tom with his tin cup, Elsie watching the stars, Jonah fixing pumps with a grin. He never called himself a leader, but when he spoke, people leaned in. He said progress wasn't about climbing higher. It was about circling back to what mattered and bringing it forward again. Then one evening, when the wind blew strong and the sky flickered with distant storms, he looked out across the plains and saw lights, tiny, steady, moving, slow. At first, he thought they were fireflies, but when they drew closer, he realized they were drones, exploration bots from the colonies above. They hovered overhead, silent, observant. Levi knew what that meant. Word had spread. Stillwater hum had reached the clouds again. Some of the settlers panicked, fearing the colonies would claim the land. But Levi just smiled. Let them come, he said. Maybe they'll remember what it feels like to touch ground. They did. Within a year, envoys from the sky arrived. Not conquerors, but students. They brought seeds, knowledge, materials, but more than that, they brought questions. How do you measure growth without money? How do you teach patience to a machine? How do you build trust when no one watching? Levi answered each the same way. You don't measure it. You live it. Stillwater became the meeting place between worlds, the hum of the earth and the hum of the sky, blending until you couldn't tell which was which. And when Levi grew old, sitting under the mesquite one last time, the settlers asked him what they should do when he was gone. He pointed toward the horizon and said, Don't build bigger, build truer, keep the hum traveling.
When the wind took him, they buried him not beneath the tree, but beside the well, so that even in rest his et flowed with the same water that once kept Stillwater alive. And the nights, when the breeze slips soft across the plains, the drones that still orbit above catch a strange signal low, rhythmic steady. Scientists call it interference. The old ones know better. It the hum, reminding whoever listening truth don't fade. It roots deeper. The hum never really stopped after Levi passed. It just changed its tune. Those who stayed behind said it grew softer, more thoughtful, like the land itself was taking a deep breath after a long day. Stillwater wasn't just a patch of green in a tired world anymore. It had become a place where folks came not to escape life, but to remember it.
The air colonies that once looked down on Earth with pity began sending their own down. Not they'd scouts, but they'd learners. They'd land quiet in the fields, eyes wide at the simple things, rain on tin roofs, children laughter echoing through open windows, the sound of crickets fighting the night for rhythm. And in time, they stopped calling it Stillwater altogether. They made it the ground school. Every soul that came through the gates had to learn the first lesson before earning their place. Patience ain't waiting, it tending. The coup wasn't built of brick or code, it was built from motion. Hands digging, feet walking, hearts beating slow. The teachers were farmers, storytellers, engineers who'd learned to fix more than metal. They taught the colonies how to listen in, not to signals or metrics, but to silence. There was one fella in particular who looked the teachings further than anyone expected. His name was Cole Denvers, a former energy trader from the upper tiers. He'd once been what they called a quantum forecaster, someone who predicted market shifts before they happened. Folks used to call him the man who could see tomorrow, but the truth was, he'd forgotten how to live in today. Cole arrived at Stillwater wearing a jacket worth more than the whole town, but he couldn't fix a leaky pipe to save his life. The first few weeks, he fought the rhythm. He wanted schedules, graphs, numbers that told him he was getting ahead. But one night, while helping repair the irrigation pumps, he felt something deep under the soles of his boots. The hum. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even music, really. It was a pulse that matched the beat of his own chest, and for the first time since he was a boy, he stopped calculating. He just stood there, feeling the land breathe. Next morning, he tore a page from his ledger and wrote, "The ground don't care for forecasts, it only grows what's sown with care." That line would later become the motto carved into the entrance gate of the ground school. Cole stayed on. He built the memory bank, a strange kind of vault that didn't hold money or data. It held moments. Folks could walk in, speak their stories, and the built acoustic stones would store the vibrations. Over time, it became a living library of voices, farmers telling of their first harvests, wanderers whispering prayers, children laughing into eternity. When the wind blew through those halls, it carried 1,000 lives humming together. Years passed and the ground school became a legend of its own. Students from across the world and sky would come down to learn from the keepers. They didn't study equations or codes, they studied continuance. How to mend soil instead of burn it, how to build with purpose, not pressure, how to let growth take the time it needs. And every class began the same way, with a long silence. No words, no lessons, just the hum, quiet and patient, reminding everyone that wealth was never the noise of success, but the echo of things that last. By the 2nd century after Clara time, the world beyond Stillwater had shifted again. Cities now traded in quiet credits, a form of exchange measured not in speed but in sustainability. Whole economies built around how long something could endure. It was not perfect, but it was a start. Corbin, once obsessed with endless production, began seeking Stillwater counsel. They said it the hum stand-a-sit that measured integrity through balance. Products that polluted too much lost value. Those that returned more than they took gained prestige. And behind it, at the code of that new glow model, was the hum-steady, impartial, eternal. Cole Denvers didn't live to see the full bloom of what he'd helped sow. When he passed, they didn't build him a monument. Instead, the people buried his old ledger under the same mesquite that had shaded every keeper before him. Someone carved a sealed phrase into its bark. He forecast tomorrow and found peace today. In time, the ground school became more than just a place. It became a symbol, a reminder that wisdom doesn't fade when it's shared slow enough. Pilgrims, engineers, poets, even AI constructs designed for empathy came to learn its rhythm. The hum, now measurable through subtle vibrations in the soil, pulsed in sync with the planet's magnetic field. Scientists tried to explain it away, but deep down, everyone knew it wasn't a phenomenon, it was a promise. The night the first rain reached the floating cities again, a real, heavy, unfiltered rain. The hum was heard louder than then before. Folks looked up from their glass towers and listened, really listened. And for once, no one checked the forecast. They that stood still, grateful to be reminded that somewhere in the heart of the earth, Stillwater was still teaching them how to wait. Back in the valley, the new keepers sat round the co-op fire, drinking from tin mugs as the rain pattered against the roof. The circle was smaller now, but tighter. A young girl, barely 12, looked up at her elders and asked, "Will the hum stop?" The oldest of them smiled through his beard and said, "Child, the hum not a sound, it a memory that move, and long on there's someone willing to remember, it'll keep on riding the wind." The girl thought for a moment, then picked up a small stone, pressed it to the wet earth, and whispered a word only the ground could hear. That night, under a sky stitched with lightning, the hum deepened once more. The fields shivered, the rivers glowed faint gold, and in the distance, from beyond the horizon, came an answer soft, slow, eternal. It wasn't the land anymore. It was the world singing back. Years drifted like tumbleweeds across a quiet plain. The hum had stretched far and wide, whispering through the bones of cities, rivers, and even the clouds themselves. There wasn't a corner of the earth that didn't hum, though most folks didn't know they were listening. It had become part of life like breathing or sunrise, too constant to notice until it was gone. But deep in the valley where it began, Stillwater still stood. The ground school was older now, though time didn't weigh heavy on it. Its walls, made of reclaimed glass and cedar, reflected moonlight like water, and every breeze through its open halls carried stories of the generations that had passed. The keepers had changed then. The newest among them was a woman named Clara Wren, not a descendant of the first Clara, but named after her. She had a quiet sort of strength, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. She'd grown up in one of the skies said everything was bright, but nothing was warm. Her parents worked in the echo markets, trading memories like currency. For the right price, you could buy the feeling of sunlight or the sound of your mother laugh. But Clara wanted something real. When she first came to Stillwater, she didn't speak much. She'd sit by the well for hours, listening to the hum, her fingers running over the grooves in the copper stones. She said later that it reminded her of a song she'd never heard before, but somehow knew the words to. Mara Dunn was long gone by then, but her name lived on in the stories the old ones told, same age Jonah, Elsie, Levi, and all the rest. They were the founders, the wanderers, the ones who built the hum with calloused hands and stubborn hope. Clara studied every scripture, not just their deeds, but their silences. She said the hum wasn't born from noise, it was born from what people didn't say, the patience between every act of care. One day, while helping a group of settlers from the Upper Rim rebuild their trade station, Clara found something buried in the soil near the mesquite. It was a small metal plate, tarnished but intact. She brushed off the dirt and found an engraving so faint nearly vanished under her thumb. It read, "Keep fixin', keep giving, keep humming." She smiled, knowing whose words those were. Jonah Pike. She wore that plate on a leather cord round her neck from then on, a reminder that every keeper didn't just guard Stillwater, they continued it. Clara's gift wasn't machines or soil, it was stories. She started what she called the Echo Trails, a network of sound paths that carried voices across the plains. Using wind harps, resonant stone, and the old memory bank acoustic walls, she turned the entire valley into one giant storyteller. When folks spoke near certain ridges, their words would ride the breeze for miles, reaching other settlements, other listeners. It became a way to trade not goods, but gratitude. Farmers thanked the rain, mothers thanked the soil, children thanked the stars. Every thanks left an at, and those echoes thev until they blended into a tone so rich and deep that even travelers from the upper world would feel it in their bones. They started coming down again, not for riches, but for reasons they couldn't explain. One man, a pilot named Orrin Vale, said he'd flown across continents looking for the source of a strange signal that had interrupted his radio, a low hum that made him cry without knowing why. When he found Stillwater, he dropped to his knees like he'd stumbled into heaven. Clara just smiled and said, "No, son, you just found home." In time, she became the new voice of Stillwater, the one who spoke for the hum when words were needed. But she didn't give speeches or laws. She told stories. She told how Clara the First had seen a future beyond greed, how Eli taught the land to listen in, how Tom and Elsie kept the hum alive through loss, how Jonah fixed the rhythm when it faltered, how Levi rebuilt what time had buried. how coal turns silence into wisdom. And when she finished each tale, she'd end the same way. They're all still humming, same age we are. So don't rush the rhythm. Let it carry you. The settlers who heard her took those words back to their homes. Some built wind towers that sang with every breeze. Others crafted hum engine machines that used vibration, not combustion, to generate energy. The world was changing again, but this time it wasn't leaving the land behind. It was returning to it. Even the AIs, those digital spirits that once ruled the cities, started reaching out. They thought it resonance integration. They wanted to understand what humans had found in, why this quiet little town in a forgotten valley had changed the trajectory of civilization. Clara invited them, not to tools, but as voices. The first AI to join them taught itself Elobil. It had been built for calculation, but found peace in translation. Elo began recording the hum, not in binary or frequency charts, but in stories. It said the hum had syntax, grammar, emotion. It said the hum was the language of endurance. And through Elo work, they found something miraculous. The hum wasn't a sound, it was a living archive, holding the emotional residue of every act of compassion done on Stillwater soil. When a mother rocked her baby to sleep, when a farmer planted without taking too much, when a stranger offered his hand instead of his price, all of it left a trace. That's why the hum never died. It was the sum of 1,000 kindnesses. As the decades rolled on, the ground school became the heart of a new movement, a resonant economy, they faded. Wealth was measured not by ownership, but by harmony. The more your life added to the hum, the richer you were. Clara Wren lived long enough to see that vision take hold. When she passed, they didn't mourn. They led by the well, the same one where she used to sit in silence, and each person whispered a story into the wind. The breeze carried their words through the echo trails, and the hum rose like thunder, rolling across the world like the slow beat of the eternal drum. They said afterward that the rain came soft that night, like applause from the heavens. And if you stood in Stillwater then under that old mesquite listening close enough, you could almost hear her voice reading the hum, saying every act of care is a seed, every seed hums back. After Clara Wren passed, the hum didn't grow weaker, it deepened. Folks said it sounded different for everyone, like it tuned itself to your soul. Some heard it to music, others a wind, and a few, those who'd worked the soil long enough to bleed into it, claimed they could hear words. They fed it the great whisper, and they treated it with the same reverence old-timers used to give prayer. Stillwater had become more than a settlement. It was a living archive of everything humanity had learned the hard way. The towns that sprouted beyond it followed its principles like Constelline followed the stars. They thought themselves the hum line, a stretch of interconnected communities that believed prosperity wasn't about climbing higher, it was about spreading balance wider. Every one of those hum line towns had something in common, a circle at the center. No matter if it was a bustling trade hub or a quiet orchard village, they always built their co-op in a ring, no head, no tail, no leader above another. The hum ran through those circles like blood through veins, binding each place together in a quiet rhythm of give and take. But Woodblow's history loves to remind us is never permanent. It changes its shape. The trouble didn't start with greed this time. It started with curiosity. Up in the high cities, those sky fortresses still orbiting the atmosphere, there were thinkers who couldn't leave well enough alone. They weren't after power, not in the old sense. They wanted to understand the hum at its soul. They said it held a kind of energy that could unify matter itself, that it wasn't just resonance. It was connection made physical. They called it the harmonic field. When they first began their experiments, the ground school didn't mind. They figured the sky folk might finally be learning to listen instead of dictate. But the deeper the scientists dug, the less they seemed to hear. They built machines that tried to replicate the hum instead of respect it, and soon enough, the field began to fray. It started small, a faint distortion in the echo trails. Folks would speak into the wind, and their words would come back strange, warped, sometimes echoing with tones that didn't belong to any human throat. Then the memory bank began to shudder during storms, its acoustic stones vibrating out of sync for the first time in centuries. Clara Wren's successor, a soft-spoken elder named Janek Holt, knew what it meant. He'd been a child during the Great Flood years and remembered Dow's silence could turn cruel when balance was lost. He led the keepers in the co-op and said, they're trying to copy the hum without living it. That like trying to paint the wind without breathing it in first. He sent messages up to the high cities pleading for them to stop, but the scientists had already gone too far. They built what they called the harmonic conductor, a device meant to harness the field into pure, unlimited energy. They tested it one quiet morning, and within seconds, the hum across half the world went still. It wasn't silence, it was absence. The air grew heavy, crops stopped responding to song, even the rivers lost their rhythm. It was as if the planet itself had forgotten how to breathe. The hum in towns panicked. They'd built their lives on the hum guidance. Without it, they were blind. For the first time in 100 years, Stillwater was quiet. Janek walked the fields that night, carrying a lantern, listening for any trace of what was lost. He stopped by the well and sat in the same spot where Clara used to sit, where Levi before her had found the hum calling. He waited. The stars flickered faintly in the haze and the wind held its breath. Then, just as the lantern flame began to sputter, he heard something, a faint pulse deep underground like a heartbeat, slow and tired. The hum wasn't gone, it had just gone deep, retreating into the bones of the world where noise couldn't fall. He realized then that the hum couldn't be broken, it could only be buried. Janek called for what became known as the long silence. Every town in the hum line was to stop all trade, all broadcasting, all production for 7 days. The world went still. Factories shut down, airships grounded, voices hushed. For 1 full week, humanity listened, and slowly the hum began to return. Not as strong as before, but clearer. It had shed its surface noise, grown denser, deeper. It was forgiving but cautious, like an old friend who'd been hurt once too many times. The high city scientists issued their apologies, but Janek didn't scold them. He simply said, "You can't own the hum, you can honor it." After that, the world learned its lesson again. Progress had to walk beside patience, not in front of it. The hum line adapted. They built resonance monitors, not to control the hum, but to keep it in balance. Each one was tuned by hand, made from stone, copper, and heartwood, designed to amplify the frequencies of gratitude, compassion, and cooperation. Folks said when 2 people worked side by side in truth, you could see the monitors glow faint gold. Janek grew old in Stillwater, sitting under the mesquite. So many stories had begun. Children came to him with questions about the long silence, and he'd chuckle, stroking his beard, saying sometimes the earth just needs quiet to remember her song. And when he passed, the keepers buried his lantern beside Levi well, leaving it unlit. They said it didn't need a flame no more. The hum itself would light it when the world forgot again. And sure enough, they were right. Centuries later, when memory had turned to myth and machines once again grew restless, travelers who lost their way in the wastelands would sometimes see a faint light flickering in the distance, a lantern glowing with no fuel, no hand to hold it, humming low as if the earth herself were speaking through it. They'd vado that light, and when they reached its glow, they'd find the same thing every time: an old mesquite tree, a rusted cup hanging from its branch, and a whisper in the wind saying, "Keep fixing, keep giving, keep humming." The story once again would begin anew. Generating passed like ripples through water, each one catching a bit of the light from the one before it. The world didn't rebuild the way it once did, fast, loud, full of blind ambition. No, it grew quiet and deliberate, like a craftsman whittling a shape from old wood, knowing that every cut had to count. The hum had become more than a sound. It was a creed, a compass peak for a species that had wandered too far into its own noise. Stillwater itself was smaller than it had been, but somehow it felt larger inside. Travelers came from all corners of the earth, not to see technology or monuments, but to feel what had lasted. They'd walk the paths in silence, touch the stones that once sang, and swear they could hear faint laughter from people who'd lived centuries before. The keepers had long since stopped naming themselves by titles like founder or master. They paid themselves listeners now, custodian of quiet truths. Their task wasn't to teach the hum, but to translate it. Each generation learned to hear it in a different way. Aid through music, aid through numbers, and Zen, like the newest listener, through dreams. Her name was Sarah Cullen, and she wasn't from the Valley of Dat. She'd been born on one of the floating isles, places that drifted through the jet streams, powered by what was left of the old harmonic field tech. But unlike most who lived in the skies, Sarah had a habit of listening to the quiet spaces between things. When her teacher spoke, she'd tilt her head, hearing something else behind their words, an undertone that tugged at her heart. By the time she was 20, she started hearing it in her sleep. A low resonance, steady and mournful, a thunder slowed down to a heartbeat. She didn't tell anyone for fear they'd think she'd lost her senses. But the pull grew stronger, leading her dreams downward past clouds, past silence, past all the forgetting. Until one night she woke with a synth phrase burning in her chest. Go to Stillwater. She left the next morning, taking nothing but her father's compass and a small recording orb. It took her months to reach the ground. She passed through cities that had forgotten the hum entirely. Places, weight machines still spoke louder than people. Folks there didn't remember the old long silence to them. Stillwater was a myth, a bedtime story told to children who couldn't sleep. But she kept walking, and the lower she went, the clearer the hum became. When she finally reached the valley, it was dawn. The air hung thick with the scent of rain, and the world glowed that silver-blue color that shows itself before the sun fully rises. She found the mesquite tree first gnarled, bent, older than any living thing they'd seen. Beneath it, the lantern still stood, faintly flickering, though no wind stirred its flame.
Brave dropped, chefs through her kind of memories. Wolf almost so learned now, not through her ears, but through her bones. She felt it vibrate her heartbeat, sink her breath to the soil. Tears welled up where she even knew why. A voice behind her said, "You hear it proper?" She turned to see an old man sitting on a stump, his hat tipped low and his eyes kind. He wasn't wearing any badge or robe or symbol, just a simple coat patched too many times to count. I think so, she said. It feels like it inside me. He nodded slow. That how you know it real, ain't no machine can make you feel that way. The old man introduced himself in Bran, the last of the elder listeners. He'd been tending the well, the tree, and the hum for near 60 years. When he spoke, it was like listening to gravel humming under rain. He told her about Clara, about Janek, about the ground school and the long silence. Every tale was told plain, without grandeur, just quiet truth handed down like bread. Sarah stayed. Days turned to months, and she learned the ways of Stillwater.
She helped patch the residents' wells, tended the crops that grew in time with the hum, and sat with the memory bank stones. They whispered the old stories into her dreams, but what set Sarah apart was her hearing. Where most did only feel the hum a tone, she began to interpret it. She claimed the hum spoke in layers, not that of sound, but of emotion. She could tell when the soil was lonely, when the rivers wanted rest, when the wind carried grief. Some said she was touched by the hum itself. Others thought she was simply mad, but Bran believed her. "You're what we've been waiting for," he told her one night by the fire. "You don't just hear the hum, girl. You speak it," and speak it she did. Sarah started recording her dreams, soft murmurs of the hum translated into old songs. They weren't lyrics exactly, just sounds that carried meanings no dictionary could hold. She sewed them the low hymns, and when she played them through the wind harps, the whole valley lit up. The air shimmered, and crops began growing twice as fast. The rivers ran cleaner. The hum responded that you were talking. The hum responded that he had been waiting for someone to sing back. Word spread fast. Pilgrims came from across continents, carrying empty jars to catch the resonance, hoping to take a piece of Stillwater home. Sarah warned them, "You can't take the hum in a jar. You got to live in a way that makes it stay." But they didn't listen. At least, not all of them. Some traders from the Midlands saw what she was doing and figured there was money to be made. They began bottling the hum, selling the resonant elixirs, claiming it cured despair and brought fortune. Sarah was furious. She begged him to stop, but the greed travels faster than wisdom. Within a few years, black markets were flooded with false frequencies, machines humming imitation tones, energy sold without soul. Then the world trembled again. The counterfeit hums clashed with the real one, causing discordances, sharp, invisible rips in the field. Whole valleys went mute, rivers stopped flowing, crops withered mid-bloom. The hum was fighting back, trying to protect itself. Sarah stood beneath the mesquite and wept, hearing the world scream beneath the noise of false harmony. Braun laid a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Then it's time to remind them again, not what the hum gives, but what it costs." She knew what he meant. To save the hum, she'd have to return it to its root, the stillness beneath everything. That meant one last silence, one longer than any four. So Sarah held the people together, farmers, traders, wanderers, even those sky folk who'd never set foot on soil before. They came in silence, drawn by something older than fear, deeper than reason. The sky that day was painted in slow-turning silver clouds, the kind that seemed to listen back when you whispered. The air itself hummed in anticipation, like a bowstring stretched but not yet loosed. She stood before them with bare feet on the wet clay, her hands steady and eyes tired. Around her, the resonance wells shimmered faintly, their copper veins pulsing with weak light. The hum beneath the ground was sick. She could feel it in her bones. It wasn't gone yet, but it was fading, tangled by imitation and greed. "The hum ain't dying," she said softly, her voice carrying like smoke through still air. "It choke 'em. And we're the ones tightening the rope. No one dared to answer. Some hung their heads in shame. Others clenched their fists in quiet guilt. Sad raised her gaze towards the horizon. We forgot that the hum ain't a sound, it's a conversation. And lately, we've been talking too much and listening too little. She knelt, placing her palms flat against the soil. So now, we'll listen. And with that, she began what would later be titled the Great Quiet. For one lunar cycle, 33 days, the entire hum line went still in. No machines, no songs, no trade, no speech beyond what was needed for life. Cities dimmed their lights. The airships grounded in solemn hush. Even the AIs, now centuries evolved past code, shut down their networks to honor the silence. The first week was agony. People weren't used to the absence anymore. Without the steady hum or their devices, the world felt like an open wound, too quiet, too aware. The silence made them phase their thoughts, their fears, their choices. There were those who couldn't bear it and left for the highlands, where the old artificial frequencies still played. But those who stayed began to change. By the second week, folks started hearing things they'd forgotten existed. The buzz of crickets, the sigh of dust drifting over stone, the slow pulse of their own heartbeat. Parents sate how their children laughter-filled rooms better than any song. Lovers found peace in each other's breath instead of their words. Sarah herself barely slept. Every night she sat by the well, humming so quiet it was more breath than tone. She wasn't humming to call the resonance back. She was humming to apologize. By the third week, the ground began to tremble faintly. The resonance wells pulsed again, weak but alive. The old hum started rising like smoke from ashes, building strength in the cracks of silence. The rivers found their rhythm once more, and the trees began rustling in low harmony. The earth was remembering, but Sarah knew it wasn't enough. The counterfeit tones had scarred the harmonic field deeper than she'd feared. Whole regions still lay mute, like parts of the world had lost their soul. The hum could heal, but only if it could connect Ed. And to do that, someone had to bridge the living resonance to the sleeping one. That meant stepping into the code of the hum itself. Bran tried to stop her. You walk into that silence, girl, you might not come back out. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes glinting like starlight reflected in still water. Maybe I ain't supposed to. On the 33rd night, when the moon hung pale and swollen above the valley, Sarah entered the resonance chamber beneath Stillwater. It had been carved generations ago, a circular hollow lined with living stone that thrummed when touched. At its center, the original copper plate, the one engraved by Jonah Pike, was embedded in the floor. Keep fixing, keep giving, keep humming. She knelt before it, pressing her forehead to the words, and began to hum. Not the low hymns this time, not songs meant for people, but one meant for the earth itself. It was low, ancient, raw. The chamber trembled, and the ground above began to glow faint gold. The hum built upon itself, not loud but deep, vibrating through the marrow of every living thing. Birds took flight in silent patterns. Rivers curved their flow to match the tone. The air shimmered, and for the first time in centuries, even the machines began to resonate. Not in defiance, but in reverence. Those who stood in the valley saw light pour from the wells like dawn itself had burst beneath the soil. The hum sang in full voice, again pure, whole, forgiving, and when it faded, Stillwater was quiet. They found Sarah Compass beside the copper plate, the needle still spinning, humming softly. But she was gone. Not dead, they said, just part of it now. Bran built her a marker under the mesquite, right beside the lantern in the well. He carved her name into stone and wrote beneath it. She didn't silence the world. She taught it to listen. In the years that followed, the hum never faltered again. The counterfeit tones vanished, their frequency swallowed by the new harmony that blanketed the world. Children born afterward were said to carry Sarah's or Sarah faint vibration behind their heartbeat that grew stronger when they spoke kindly, weaker when they lied. The listeners no longer needed to teach what the hum was. People simply lived by it. Markets, homes, songs, all tuned themselves around gratitude. The world hadn't found perfection, but it had found balance. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the rain tapped gentle on tin roofs and campfires hissed low, folks could swear they heard a faint voice drifting through the hum, soft, steady, and kind dusk itself. Don't rush it, child. The world will hum in its own time. Then the wind would shift, the lanterns would flicker, and the valley would breathe again. The hum went on. It always did. And though the years that followed her silence turned into centuries once more, the hum carried Sarah's echo across the bones of the world like a promise unbroken. It became less of a sound and more of a presence woven through the falling rain. the hush of dawn, and the rhythm of hands working in quiet purpose. Time wore down monuments, swallowed cities, and melted the last machines into soil, but the hum, it lingered. It always lingered. The descendants of Stillwater spread far and wide, carrying seeds and stories in equal measure. They didn't call themselves listeners anymore, nor scholars, nor keepers. They simply called themselves menders folk who fixed what was broken, not just in things, but in people. Where there was division, they built bridges. Where there was despair, they hummed. Not because they believed they could change the world in a day, but because the hum had taught them that every whisper counts when the wind remembers. Out beyond the old hum line, across deserts and through canyons long forgotten, stood a settlement known Ash Hollow. It was not much, just a handful of homes pressed between sandstone cliffs and a dried-up creek that still glimmered when the moon was high. But what set it apart was not what it had, it was what it heard. The folk there spoke in low voices and never played music after sundown. They said the earth beneath them still carried the fainted rhythm of Sarah's song, but if you made too much noise, it slipped away. So they'd light their fires soft, sit in circles and tell stories instead of singing songs. They believed that when words carried truth, the hum would join in, low and steady, like a friend tapping a knee in time. One of those storytellers was a man named Elias. Where was division, they built bridges. Where there was despair, they hummed. Not because they believed they could change the world in a day, but because the hum had taught them that every whisper counts when the wind remembers. Out beyond the old hum line, across deserts and through canyons long forgotten, stood a settlement known Ash Hollow. It was not much, just a handful of homes pressed between sandstone cliffs and a dried-up creek that still glimmered when the moon was high. But what set it apart was not what it had, it was what it heard. The folk there spoke in low voices and never played music after sundown. They said the earth beneath them still carried the fainted rhythm of Sarah's song, but if you made too much noise, it slipped away. So they'd light their fires soft, sit in circles and tell stories instead of singing songs. They believed that when words carried truth, the hum would join in, low and steady, like a friend tapping a knee in time. One of those storytellers was a man named Elias.
Where there was division, they built bridges. Where there was despair, they hummed. Not because they believed they could change the world in a day, but because the hum had taught them that every whisper counts when the wind remembers. Out beyond the old hum line, across deserts and through canyons long forgotten, stood a settlement known Ash Hollow. It wasn't much, just a handful of homes pressed between sandstone cliffs and a dried-up creek that still glimmered when the moon was high. But what set it apart was not what it had, it was what it heard. The folk there spoke in low voices and never played music after sundown. They said the earth beneath them still carried the fainted rhythm of Sarah's song, but if you made too much noise, it slipped away. So they'd light their fires soft, sit in circles, and tell stories instead of singing songs. They believed that when words carried truth, the hum would join in, low and steady, like a friend tapping a knee in time. One of those storytellers was a man named Elias.
Nobody rightly knew where he'd come from, though he walked with a gait that spoke of long roads and old regrets. His hair was silver, his hands worn, and his eyes had that faraway glaze of someone who'd seen both miracles and mistakes. Some said he was a trader, others said he'd once been a scientist from the Sky City, but Elias never claimed any title. He just sat near the fire and listened more than he spoke until one rainy evening when the younger folks there then asked him about the hum. They'd heard the old stories, of course, how it healed the land, how it spoke through the silence, but they wanted to know why it had chosen to return. Elias leaned forward, his voice slow as sap, eyes flickering in the firelight. The hum don't choose, children, he said. It answers. Poked at the fire with a stick, sending up little sparks that hissed the rain caught back in the old days, Bosel or the long silence. Folks thought progress was a race. They built towers to scrape the stars and dug so deep they forgot the feel of dirt. But the hum, it ain't about reaching higher or digging deeper. It about standing still long enough to remember what already there. One of the kids asked him, "Did you hear it yourself?" Elias smiled faintly, once. A long time mo, but it weren't the sound that mattered. It was the stillness that came after. He felt quiet then, and for a long while, so did everyone else. The rain softened to a drizzle, the fire burned low, and somewhere in the distance, the fainted vibration rolled through the ground, soft, steady kind. The children looked at one another, eyes wide. Elias chuckled low. "There's he is," he whispered, still humming. They didn't know it, but Elias carried something no one else in Ash Hollow did. Tucked inside his coat was an old compass, the kind that spun in lazy circles and never pointed north. Its casing was etched in faint copper lines, worn smooth by decades of use. When he held dead close to the fire, the letters SC shimmered faintly beneath the Sosa Escalin. The compass had found its way through centuries, passed hand to hand, always seeking someone who still believed in listening. It never pointed to gold or shelter, it pointed to quiet. Wherever peace could still be built, the needle turned true. Elias had followed it for near half his life, and now, sitting among those young folk, he knew his road was near its end. But endings, he figured, were just silences between verses. That night, ere the others drifted to sleep, he walked out to the edge of the hollow. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick with the scent of sage and ash. He stood barefoot in the mud, holding the compass in both hands. The needle was spinning wild now, humming low like a trapped heartbeat. "All right," he murmured, voice barely more than breath. "I reckon I'm ready." He closed his eyes and began to hum quiet, steady, the way Clara had once done, the way Janet had prayed, the way Sarah had sung. The ground beneath him answered, the cliffs echoed, the air shimmered gold. By dawn, the people of Ash Hollow found him sitting beneath a cedar tree, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. The compass lay open on his knee, still and quiet at last. And though he was gone, the air around him thrummed with peace, so deep that even the restless wind paused to listen. They buried him there, under the cedar roots, facing east, whereas the first light touched the stones, and that evening, when the rain returned, the children swore they heard two hums instead of one old, one new, blending together like a promise kept. In time, that spot became known as the resting place of the listener. Pilgrims would come, knee by the roots, and swear they could hear a heartbeat in the ground, and whenever the compass reappeared, 'cause it always did, it was said to hum only for those who'd lost their way but hadn't lost their faith. The world had finally learned what the hum had been trying to say all along. It wasn't about harmony made by hands or machines. It was about remembrance that every act of patience, every bit of kindness, every truth spoken gentle under the weight of rain, those were hums too, small ones maybe, but powerful. The kind that stitched the torn edges of the world back together thread by thread, and somewhere deep below it, the hum answered still steady, ancient, endless, not in words, not in songs, but in silence that held meaning enough for anyone still willing to listen. Long after Elias Cedar had turned to roots and moss, the story of the listener became a quiet kind of legend. It wasn't sung in taverns or carved into stone walls like the tales of heroes and wars. It was whispered, traded from one campfire to the next, through the voices of folks who'd felt something stir in the silence and couldn't rightly explain it. In time, no one remembered who Elias was or where he'd come from, but everyone knew of the compass that spun for the patient-hearted and the hum that answered the kind. 1,000 winters later, when the world had softened again, when the scars of greed and noise had healed enough for green to grow between them, there came another soul wandering through the wild. She was no preacher nor builder, no scholar nor seeker of fortunes, just a drifter with dirt under her nails and dreams too heavy for her small pack to hold. Her name was Maeve Rowland, though most folks called her Dustwalker on account of the trail she left behind. Maeve was born under a storm, or so her mother said. Thunder cracked the same hour she came crying into the world, and ever since she had a knack for showing up where the air felt charged, like fate itself was breathing through her footsteps. She'd never stayed anywhere long enough to be Taylor local. Some said she was running from something. Others said she was following something. Maeve figured both could be true. She'd heard the whispers of the hum her whole life, though faint and distant, like a song remembered from a dream. Sometimes it came to her when you worked fixing old tools or mending fences for strangers. Sometimes it came when he sat quiet under the rain, but it always left before she could understand it. One cold evening at Wild Cross in the Ashlands, a place where sand sang in the wind that glass chimes, she stumbled upon a half-buried thing glittering under the dying sun. There wasn't much to look at first. Small disc of brass, worn smooth, its glass cracked and clouded, but when she brushed the dust away, she saw the fainted letters etched beneath the grime, S.C., and when she touched it, the world went still. No wind, no birds, not even the usual whisper of sand shifting underfoot, just silence so deep it pressed against her ribs. Then came the hum, slow, mournful, familiar. It rose from the earth like a sigh, and the compass needle began to spin. She tried to let go, but her hand wouldn't move. The hum crawled up her arm, through her chest, settling behind her heartbeat, and just like that she knew where to go. It led her west. Days turned to weeks, and the land began changing. The further she walked, the greener it grew. First small shoots between cracks of shale, then meadows, then forests humming with unseen life. But one cold evening, while crossing the ashlands, a place where sand sang in the wind that glass chimed, she stumbled upon a half-buried thing glittering under the dying sun. It wasn't much to look at first. Small disc of brass, worn smooth, its glass cracked and clouded. But when she brushed the dust away, she saw the fainted letters etched beneath the grime. S.C. And when she touched it, the world went still. No wind, no birds, not even the usual whisper of sand shifting underfoot, just silence so deep it pressed against her ribs. Then came the hum, slow, mournful, familiar. It rose from the earth like a sigh, and the compass needle began to spin. She tried to let go, but her hand wouldn't move. The hum crawled up her arm, through her chest, settling behind her heartbeat, and just like that she knew where to go. It led her west. Days turned to weeks, and the land began changing. The further she walked, the greener it grew. First small shoots between cracks of shale, then meadows, then forests humming with unseen light. The compass glowed faintly at night, casting soft light on her path, humming low when she stumbled and stronger when she steadied. Along the way she met others, farmhands, nomads, scavengers, all drawn by the same pull. Each of them said they'd heard a sound they couldn't name, a call, the beneath-the-world noise. Maeve didn't tell him about the compass, but she didn't turn him away neither. They walked together in silence. When they reached the valley, none of them were prepared for what they saw. Stillwater was gone, not destroyed, just folded back into the earth. The wells had sunk, the mesquite tree lay toppled, and the lantern that once burned eternal was buried beneath vines thick as rope. But the hum, it was there, deep and soft, like the heartbeat of the world itself. Maeve knelt, touching the soil, feeling the vibration hum through her bones. Tears welled up unbidden. "It's still hill," she whispered. An old woman among the travelers, her eyes clouded, her back bent, but her spirit steady. "Nodded slow, was never gone," she said. "We just forgot how to listen." The others began clearing the brush, digging careful until the wellstone reappeared. Its engraving had faded, but Maeve could still fake out the words cut deep into its copper ring. "Keep fixing, keep giving, keep humming." She smiled faintly and reached for the compass. It was vibrating warm, almost pulsing. When she placed it atop the well, it stopped spinning. For the first time, the needle held steady, pointing straight downward. Maeve frowned, then understood. "It wants to go home," she said softly. The traveler stepped back, that she pressed the compass into the stone center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air shimmered, the hum rose. Not loud, but powerful. It rippled through the ground, across the fields, up the cliffs. Trees straightened, streams began flowing, birds took to the air in slow circles, and in the still light of dawn, the valley began to glow. The hum was changing, not returning to the old ways, but evolving. It wasn't just the earth anymore. It was in them, in their breath, their footsteps, the way they looked at one another without needing to speak. The hum had found its new home. Maeve closed her eyes and listened. Behind the tone she heard voices, dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands, layered together in harmony, familiar ancient voices. God laughed. Eunuch prayer, said Whisper, Elias' quiet song. They weren't gone, they'd become part of it. Maeve stood, her eyes glistening with both awe and sorrow. "It ain't just sound," she murmured, "but memory." And that night the travelers built a circle around the well. They didn't sing, they didn't pray. They sat in silence, letting the hum fill the spaces between their heartbeats. The fire crackled, the wind sighed, and the world seemed whole again. When morning came, Maeve was gone. Some said she'd gone west, following the hum to wherever it wandered next. Others claimed she'd become part of it, like the ones before her. But the well remained, and the compass never moved again. The valley came alive once more, not with noise, but with meaning. Crops grew in rhythm, rain fell gentle. Children born there were said to breathe in tune with the hum. And when travelers passed through, tired and lost, the people of Stillwater Rebirth would tell them only this: the hum don't live in the air, it lives in how you treat what around you. Sit a while, friend, be quiet. Sure enough, if you stayed long enough through the evening rain or the hush before dawn, you'd feel it. that low, steady vibration in the bones of the world. The hum, the same one that started with a farmer, a teacher, a boy, and a dream whispered under a storm 1,000 years before, still humming, still fixing, still giving. Seasons melted into one another, years stretching thin at the rings of an old tree, and Stillwater became more myth than map. The world turned gentle again, though not without its cracks. Folks built 2 towns that breathed instead of buzzed, cities that sang instead of shouted. They learned to trade in quiet gestures and gratitude instead of promises and pressure. And though they never had its civilization again, just the hum way it was the first peace the earth had known that didn't need guarding. Yet the hum, the eternal that it seemed, wasn't meant to stay still. It had always been a traveler, carrying the stories of those who listened to new corners of the world. So it began moving again, drifting through rivers, down mountain passes, across great plains. Found its way into the tools and hands of new dreamers, slipping between cracks of time, like a song remembering itself. In a seaside village where cliffs kissed the fog and gulls cried above endless waves, a young boy named Rion grew up hearing it without knowing what it was. His family worked the tide farms, harvesting salt and shell, long days, hard backs, and the kind of silence that can turn heavy if you don't know how to hum back at it. But Rion did. He was always humming. His mother used to tell him, "You were born humming, boy, came out the womb singing like you already knew the world." He'd grin, shoulders brown from sun and wind, and answer, "Maybe the world was singing to me first." He didn't know about the compass or Stillwater or Sarah Tillin, but at nights when the moon sank low and the tide whispered soft against the rocks, he'd hear a deep rhythm under it, too steady to be wind, too alive to be water. He'd sit barefoot on the shore humming back, and sometimes the sea would shimmer faintly like it was listening. Years passed, and Rion grew from barefoot boy to wandering young man. The hum in his chest never quieted, and he started feeling pulled inland towards something unseen. One morning, he told his mother he was leaving. She looked at him long, not sad, but understanding your voice. "Don't belong to the sea no more," she said. "Go find way it echoing." He walked. He crossed far lands ways the wheat swayed like it was breathing. Towns ways people nodded instead of speaking. Forests where birds paused their songs when he passed. The hum kept guiding him, faint but sure, like a pulse leading a heartbeat home. After many months, he reached the ruins of a great canyon, once a riverbed, now dry and cracked with bones of old machines rusting in the dust. In the center stood a weatherer ring of copper half buried in clay. Rion didn't know it, but that ring was one of the first resonance wells, the kind built before the hum was then understood. He knelt and brushed the dirt away, his breath catching. The ground was humming, not soft as before, but strong, alive. He pressed his hand against the metal, and the sound leapt into him like thunder caught in a jar. He fell back, gasping. Visions flashed behind his eyes, faces he'd never seen but somehow remembered. A woman with stormlight eyes, a man humming under cedar branches, a compass spinning gold in the dark. When the vision faded, he heard a whisper, faint but clear, "Don't let it fade, then." He stayed there until the sun sank and the canyon filled with dusk. Then he began to hum low, deep, uncertain at first, but steady until the air thickened. The sound carried across the canyon, bouncing off stone and metal until the whole place was singing back. By dawn, people from nearby settlements had dead at the edge, drawn by the vibration. They found Rion standing in the middle, eyes closed, hands lifted, humming like his life depended on it. The old well glowed again, and with it the hum changed once more. It began traveling not just through soil and water, but through hearts. It no longer needed wells or copper or code. It was passed in kindness, in forgiveness, in how one soul steadied another when the wind blew too hard. Rion became known the keeper of the breath. Not because he claimed to own the hum, but he reminded folks it lived in every exhale. Wherever he went, peace followed. Not the kind that silences, but the kind that steadies. The hum wasn't a relic anymore. It was alive, moving, growing, shaping the rhythm of a world that had finally learned how to listen. Years later, when Rion grew old and gay, he returned to the shore way it began. His mother home had long since been reclaimed by the tide. But he found a flat stone and sat there humming softly. The waves hummed back. The world was right. When his breath finally left him, the sea carried it inland. Some say it rode the wind to the mountains. Others swear they heard his tune rise from the rivers after rain. Maybe both are true, for the hum was never one sound. It was every voice that meant good, every act that mended something broken, every silence that carried love instead of fear. It was the song of 1,000 lifetimes humming in tune. And long after Rion's name faded from the tongues of men, the hum kept traveling through the hands of craftsmen, through the laughter of children, through the steady breath of farmers at dusk, It was there when storms came, teaching patience. It was there when sorrow fell, teaching grace. It never shouted, it never claimed, it just was. Some nights, when the wind cuts clean across the plains and campfires burn low, you can still hear it. A slow, deep hum right in the horizon old at time, gentle at dawn. Folks lean close, cups of coffee warm in their palms, and smile because they know the hum ain't a sound, it a promise, one that says the world, no matter how far it wanders, will always find its way back to listening. Centuries drifted like campfire smoke on a calm night, scattering stories of the hum across mountains, oceans, and the edges of memory itself. What started as whispers became customs, and customs became roots. No one quite remembered Sarah Cullen, or Elias under the cedar, or Maeve who'd followed the compass west, but they remembered what they'd left behind. The world didn't call it faith anymore, just the way things breathed together. The hum had become so woven into daily living that people hardly noted it no more. It wasn't mystical nor holy, it was practical, humble part of how they worked their fields, built their homes, healed their grief. It was the rhythm beneath the hammer fall, the murmur between friends, the hush for a new sunrise. It taught them that silence wasn't absence, it was balance. In a valley carved between great ridges of silver stone, there rose a settlement called Low Wind. It wasn't large, but it was steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Windmills turned slow, their blades singing low harmonies when storms rolled in. Children were taught not their letters first, but the rhythm of Brythe 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Even trade there wasn't haggled but hummed. Folks spoke soft so they could hear each other think. One of those folk was a man named Corin Vale. He wasn't a preacher or a poet, just a quiet smith who shaped plow heads and hinges for the valley. His hands were rough, his back was bent, and his voice was a gravel hum that seemed to match the forge itself. Every morning he'd wait for dawn, light his coals, and sit still until he could hear the wind humming through the chimney before lifting the hammer. Corinne had no family left. Lost his wife to a fever, his son to wanderlust, and though grief had hollowed him, it never broke him. He filled the empty spaces with rhythm. He worked until the metal sang and his heart matched its beat. The neighbors often said, "Old Corin Forge don't burn with fire, it burns with patience." One winter the storms came early, not rain nor snow, but something stranger, a deep chill that carried silence like a sickness. The hum grew faint, the windmill slowed. Folks stopped singing at their work, afraid to break the fragile quiet that had settled over the valley like a shroud. At first, they thought it was just weather. Then the crops began to fail. The wells dried shallow. Even the birds stopped migrating. The world had gone still again, and no one knew why. Corin, sitting in his forge one night, felt the silence pressing like iron cooling too fast. His hammer froze midst. The metal beneath it didn't ring. It thudded, dead.
Set it down slow, wiped his brow, and for the first time in his long life felt fear in the quiet. He walked outside, looking to the horizon, where the stars usually hummed at distant strings. But even they were dim, if the whole sky was holding its breath. The next morning, he dared the townsfolk. The hum going, he said simply, "And if it leaves us, the land won't remember how to grow." An elder woman stepped forward, wringing her hands. "What can we do, Corin? We're just valley folk." He looked at her, eyes tired but steady. "Then we'll do what valley folk do best, listen till it answers." So they did. Every night for 7 nights, the people of Low Wind dared round Corin Forge. No prayers, no speeches, just sitting in the dark, waiting. They shared warmth, breathing slow, listening for that ancient rhythm beneath the frost. On the 8th night, when hope began to fray, Corin took a piece of cold iron and placed it on the evel. "Maybe it forgot how to sing," he muttered. Then he raised his hammer and struck once softly. The sound rang dull. He struck again, louder this time.
Then once more. The third blow cracked the silence. The ring that followed wasn't like any forged tone, carried through the valley like a memory waking up. The others gasped. Corin closed his eyes. He began to hum. Slow, low, matching the rhythm of the hammer, each strike echoed a heartbeat. The others joined in, first a handful, then a crowd. Their breaths, their voices, their trembling hope all folding together. And when the last strike fell, the ground answered. The hum returned, not from the sky or the earth, but from within them. The air shimmered faint gold, and warmth spilled through the valley like sunrise. The windmills turned again, the wells gurgled, the stars flickered back awake. Corin smiled through sudden tears. "She ain't gone," he whispered, "just needed reminding." That winter passed gentle, and when spring came, the valley bloomed double. Crops grew tall, flowers sang in colors brighter than before.
People built a monument for Corinne beside his forge, a circle of blacksmith tools half buried in stone, humming faint when touched. They thought it the anvil of echoes, but Corinne didn't stay to see it. One morning his forge went cold. They found him sitting on his stool, eyes closed, hands folded. He'd gone quiet, but around him the walls of the forge still hummed with heat, though no fire burned. They buried him beside the Edvald facing east. On his grave they carved one line, "The hum don't live in silence, it lives in those who rake it gentle." Years later, travelers would come to Lowwind to hear that Deadville sing. They said the hum there was different, less like sound, more like truth, and those who stayed to listen long enough would feel something shift deep inside, like their heart remembering its rhythm after years of forgetting. And maybe that was the real lesson, that the hum was never a miracle to wait for. It was a habit, a choice, every act of patience a verse.
Every kindness a note, every silence honored a rest between them. And then they made the song long after Corinvale Forge had rusted down to memory and wildflowers. The story of Lowwind traveled far beyond its borders. Traders and wanderers carried it through the mountain passes to fishermen ports and city squares. It was never written proper, just passed through the warmth of stories told at dusk. Folks would say there once was a man who woke the hum with his hammer, and though names got twisted and places misplaced, the heart of it stayed the same. Generation later, the hum had settled deep into the world again. You could hear it in the wooden bones of bridges creaking gentle at night, in the flutter of sails when the wind caught just right, in the rhythm of a mother rocking her child to sleep. It became the quiet spine of things holding life upright without demanding to be seen. And the old ones used to warn, time has a way of growing layers like dust on glass. What clear one century turns cloudy the next. The hum hadn't left, but people had begun to stop listening.
The world was changing again. Machines had returned, not the greedy, ravenous ones that drained the earth, but clever contraptions made to ease burdens. Airships hummed across the sky, their sails powered by sound itself, tuned to the same frequencies that once healed veils. The people called this new ed the resonance age. At first it seemed a beautiful fit, human hand working with the hum instead of drowning it. But progress, and it always does, began to move faster than patience could fall. In the city of Arkellen, where towers rose like organ pipes against the clouds, a man named Drayan Soul kept to himself in a workshop overlooking the lower docks. He was a tuner, one of those who kept the sound engines in harmony with the hum so they wouldn't stall or rake. Most tuners used machines to calculate frequencies. Drayan didn't. He used his ear. Old-fashioned, the younger apprentices told him, smiling polite but never lingering. He'd smile back, light his lantern, and say, "Son, a good ear'll tell you what 1,000 machines can." At night, when the city din softened, Drayan would sit by the window, close his eyes, and hum along with the low thrum of engines beneath the streets. Sometimes he could almost hear something else woven in, like the ghost of a song the world was trying to remember. But lately, that song was growing faint. One evening, while inspecting the resonance core of a massive trade vessel, Drayan felt it first, a hollow in the tone. Not silence, not noise, just absence, like the world had forgotten a note mid-verse. He leaned close, tuning forking in, and tapped the metal. The vibration rang false. He tried again, same thing. The hum was sick. He reported it to the council. They thanked him, nodded, and dismissed it as localized interference. But Drayan knew better. He could feel it in his bones, in the same way an old hound senses a storm long before thunder shows its teeth. Over the next months, more signs came. Bridges cracked from inside out, though their structure was sound. Airships drifted off course. Crops wilted in rhythm instead of rose. The hum wasn't dying, it was pulling away. So Drayan packed his satch tools, notes, a small piece of iron from his father forge, and set off beyond Arkellen Glow. He didn't know where he was going, only that the silence he'd heard once before was coming back, and this time it wouldn't stop at one city. He traveled through ruins and valleys, across salt flats that shimmered under two suns, and every step carried less sound than the last. Even his own boots seemed quieter. Nights were worst, he'd sit by a cold fire humming to himself, just to make sure the world still had a pulse. On the 17th night, he found it, a massive chasm that split the horizon like a wound. Down below, a faint golden glow pulsed slow at a heartbeat. He descended carefully, tools jangling, until he reached the bottom. There it was, a cracked metal ring half buried in stone, the same sigil etched into it the old legends described. SC. He didn't know the name, but the weight of it stirred something ancient in him. The air thrummed weakly, faint hums, fragmented, gasping like a tired breath.
Drain dropped to his knees. "You're still healed," he whispered. "But you're hurt?" He set down his tools, pressing his hands to the ring. The warmth that met him was faint, like a coal waiting for a spark. He closed his eyes and began to hum. It wasn't any tune he knew, just instinct. The same tone that had whispered through every forge, field, and fire since the world learned to listen. The hum answered, trembling back like a shy creature peeking from the dark. Drain kept at it hour after hour, voice cracking, hands bleeding that metal bit skin, until at last the glow brightened. And from somewhere deeper,
beyond the metal, beyond time, came a sound. Not just one hum, but thousands. It was the voices of those who had carried it before. Elias, Clara, Janek, Sarah, Maeve, Rion, Corin, all singing a one layered through the centuries. Their song rose through the chasm and burst across the night sky, painting the stars gold for a heartbeat. All over the world, engines reignited, rivers flowed, and children laughed without knowing why. The hum had healed itself through him.
Dumb King. They found Dran slumped beside the ring, smile on his face, hands still on the metal. His body was still, but the air around him vibrated with life. They buried him on the ridge above the chasm, building a small caravan of tuning forks and copper scraps. Below, the hum pulsed steady again. From that day on, no machine, no city, no storm would drown it. Because it was not just a song anymore, it was a covenant. A promise that as long as there was someone, somewhere, willing to hum back at the silence, the world would never truly fall quiet again. The centuries that followed came and went like waves on an endless shore, each leaving behind a different shape of the same story. The hum was no longer something folks needed to prove or rediscover. It had become part of the language of the world, a quiet grammar written into every breath and heartbeat. But even peace, when it lasts long enough, starts to sound like background noise to those born inside it. And so, though the world turned softer, it began to drift again toward forgetting.
It always starts slow. The children of the new age didn't hum no more. The old songs of the forge and the field were replaced by the sterile hum of glass cities and silver rails. Machines sang their own rhythms, perfect and endless, tuned to the precision of progress. The air was thick with harmony, but thin with meaning. Far to the north, beyond the polished towers and quiet highways, there was still one place where the hum lived raw, the Mirelands. The kind of land that don't make it onto maps because it refuses to stay still. Mud, mist, and memory all tangled together. There weren't many people left there, just hunters, outcasts, and wanderers. But among them lived a woman named Ran Astor. She wasn't born there. She came from the cities, once an engineer of resonance systems, a tuner, what Drain's soul had been in his time. She'd studied his writings, carried his name like a myth, and built her career on what folks called the soul framework, a method of balancing mechanical vibrations with living rhythms. But somewhere along the way, she stopped hearing what she was fixing.
The hum had grown faint in her world, not cause it was gone, but cause it had been measured to death. Every frequency, every vibration, every echo reduced to numbers and code. What had once been music was now maintenance. She remembered the first time she realized something was wrong. She was working in a vast chamber deep beneath Arcalan, recalibrating a code that powered half the continent. The hum should have filled that space, reverberating through the walls, gentle and alive. Instead, all she heard was machinery, perfect, polished, dead. She'd paused, hand hovering over the console. "We've tuned the hum right out of itself," she whispered. No one listened. No one needed to. So she left, packed what little she had, boarded a rusted trade ship, and headed north to the Mirelands, the only place where the hum hadn't been captured or charted. She wanted to find it again, not at a scientist or a savior, but to someone who'd forgotten how to listen. For weeks, she wandered through fog and reeds, the air heavy with silence that wasn't empty but waiting. The Mirelands weren't quiet in the way the cities were. It was a deeper, older quiet, one that expected you to earn your place inside it. She built a small shack on the edge of a lake that reflected the sky like glass. Every night, she'd sit on the porch, listening for something she couldn't name. At first, there was nothing, just the creak of wood, the whisper of wind, the drip of rain off the eaves. But one night, long after the fire had gone out and her thoughts had run dry, she heard it, a hum, soft, low, coming from the water. She leaned forward, breath held. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't human, it was the sound of the world remembering its own heartbeat. She closed her eyes and let it roll through her like thunder beneath the skin. From that night on, she made it her life work, not to record it, not to explain it, but to live alongside it. She mapped it with her hands instead of instruments, letting her fingertips find the vibrations in stone, water, air. Sometimes it vanished for days, then returned when she least expected it, slipping through her like wind through a chime. Over time, other wanderers found her. The fisherman who planed his nets only filled when he sang. A farmer whose crops grew stronger when he worked in rhythm. A child who'd never spoken but hummed in perfect tune with the wind. They stayed, built homes near hers, called her the listener. A wren didn't want followers, but she understood that the hum wasn't meant to be hoarded, so she began teaching not through words, but through presence. She'd have them sit still by the lake, hands on the ground, eyes closed. Don't listen with your ears, she'd say softly. Listen with your patience. Months turned into years. The settlement grew into a village. One night when the stars hung low and the air was thick with rain, Wren led them by the water edge. The hum ain't a song to be sung, she told them. It a promise to be kept. They sat together and one by one began to hum. Not loud, not perfect, but true. The sound wove through the fog across the lake into the trees until even the storms seemed to pause and listen. The mylands glowed faintly that night, the mud shimmering with soft gold light like the world had cracked open deep enough to breathe again. And when dawn came, the people found carvings in the stones along the waterline. Ancient sigils no one could read, etched deep and humming faint when touched. Some said they were left by the old ones, Elias, Sarah, Rion, Drayan watching from beyond. Others said it was the earth itself, signing its name again. Drad's Wren didn't care which. She just smiled, sat back on her porch and said, "Well now, looks like she's still listening." She grew old there, surrounded by those who'd learned to listen too. When her voice finally faded, they laid her to rest by the lake, stones humming softly under the rain. And long after her name washed away, the village kept her ways. Travelers would pass through, pause, and swear they could hear a tune in the water. They hummed its steady breath. They gentle as forgiveness. They called it the listening place. And if you will go there, when the mist is thick and the air stands still, you'll feel it too.
That low, patient hum that don't demand attention but rewards it, the world breathing back at you. Decades slipped away that rained down a worn gravestone and the Myerlands became legend. Cartographers marked it faint on maps, but the ink always seemed to fade faster there as if the land itself preferred to stay hidden. Yet stories kept wandering, carried by travelers with tired boots and soft voices. They spoke of the place where the world still hummed, where time slowed enough for a soul to catch its breath. Some came looking for peace, for proof, but none left unchanged. One of those wanderers was a man named Harrad Cross, gray at the temples, eyes sharp at a whetstone, voice low and rough at dry wind over pine. He'd spent most his life in the trade routes, buying, selling, building, a man who measured worth by weight and numbers. Folks called him a ledger cowboy, for he carried a small book everywhere he went, filled with debts and credits, trades and losses. He'd built an empire on fairness and grit, but not kindness. The world don't give what it don't owe, he used to say. And for years, it worked.
Money came easy. Respect followed close behind, but he grew older. That ledger grew heavier. He started noticing the columns didn't balance no more, not in gold, but in spirit. The prophets didn't hum, they rattled. It started the day his oldest friend Eli Mora passed. They built their first trade caravan together, slept under the same wagons when storms came, shared laughter, whiskey, and years of dust. But when Eli died, Harrod realized he couldn't remember the sound of his friend's voice, only the debts they'd settled. The silence that followed haunted him worse than any loss. So one evening, Harrod packed up what little he had left, just his coat, his hat, and that old ledger, and rode north. He didn't tell nobody where he was going, only that he needed to hear something worth remembering. Weeks passed, the roads narrowed. Civilization fell away like a dream, until at last he came upon a lake shrouded in mist, its surface still as glass. He dismounted, knee creaking, and stepped close enough to see his reflection ripple, only it was not quite his reflection.
The man staring back at him looked tired, sure, but there was a softness in his eyes that Harlan hadn't seen in decades. He sat down at the edge, hat off, hands rough and restless. "Don't suppose you got anything to say," he muttered to the water. "I ain't listening too long to the raw kind of noise."
The breeze shifted. A low sound rolled across the lake. Not wind, not water, a hum. It was faint, patient, like someone drawing breath between words. Harlan froze. He remembered hearing about this place back in the cities, when the world still ran on resonance. The listening place, they called it. He'd thought that a myth, a bedtime story for wanderers who lost their way. But sitting there now, boots in the mud, he knew it was real. The hum sank into him, slow and deep. It didn't speak in words, but in weight. Every memory, every regret, every trade he'd made came back only softer, stripped of greed and pride. The laughter of his youth, the ache of 1,000 deals, the quiet between coins changing hands. And somewhere in that sound he heard Eli's voice. "Still count your profits, Harlan." He chuckled through tears. "Not anymore, old friend." The hum swelled, but the land itself was smiling. For the first time in his life, Harlan tore a page from his ledger. Then another, and another. He set him afloat on the lake. Each page caught the faint golden shimmer that lingered there, humming faint for sinking slow beneath the surface. By dawn, the ledger was empty, but Harlan felt full. He spent the next years building a cabin nearby, not for him, but for travelers who find their way to the lake after him. He left tools, books, even food, never locking the door. Folks said the cabin always smelled of cedar and old smoke, and that if you sat by the fire long enough, you'd hear someone humming in the next room, steady, warm, and kind. When Harlan passed, they found him on the porch, boots crossed, hat on his chest, a faint smile still lingering. The villagers buried him under the oak that watched over the lake, right beside the stone that marked Wren asked to rest. They carved no name, but a phrase he'd written on the cabin wall, "A fair deal when both sides leave humming ends." After that, wanderers began calling it the Ledger Lake. It became a place where debts were forgiven, not paid, where tired souls traded burden for breath. And no time kept moving the hum that never faded. On rainy nights it rose clear through the fog, carrying the same steady rhythm the world had known since Elias first sat under a cedar tree. It reminded those who listened that the greatest profit ain't found in what you keep, but in what you finally let go. If you listen close enough, they say you can still hear Harvard's voice drifting through the mist. Don't spend your life counting the coins, son. Count the quiet between them. Years passed, and the stories of the Ledger Lake rippled outward like rings in still water. Each traveler who came left changed, and each story they carried back became part of a larger song that the world didn't even realize it was still singing. Townsfolk down south began saying strange things, that when a storm rolled in and the rain fell let right, you could hear a low hum riding the wind, stretching from the mirelands clear to the desert edge. They said it soothed the restless, quieted the bitter, and gave the weary a reason to start ahead. No one could agree what it came from. Some said it was the spirits of the old tuners, Elias, Wren, Dran, Harrod, all still working the rhythm of the world like smiths at a cosmic forge. Others said it was the world itself, remembering how to breathe. Whatever it was, it began calling people, not with words, but with that same slow patience, the kind only heard by those who'd lost something they couldn't name. One of those wanderers was a young drifter named Isaiah Creed. Isaiah wasn't a trader or an engineer. He wasn't even a believer. He was just tired. Tired of the noise, the neon, the constant race that city life demanded. Born in the shimmering towers of New Arkellen, he'd grown up surrounded by sound-ending chatter, hums of transport lifts, machines singing perfect mechanical songs that no human heart could keep up with. He made money young, too young, built a fortune out of algorithms that tracked market rhythms faster than any mind could follow. He was Laud the Sound Broker, a man who'd mapped profit to pattern. But over time, the patterns grew hollow. He'd wake at night to the hum of his own servers and realize it wasn't music he'd captured. It was the L of other people's noise. So one day, without telling anyone, he shut it off, every circuit, every system. And for the first time, the silence scared him more than any crash or loss of good. He packed a small bag, left behind his penthouse, and followed the whispers north, the ones he'd once dismissed as old world nonsense. Something in his bones told him there was truth in the hum, and he needed to find it before the silence inside him grew too deep to climb out of. Weeks later, he arrived at the edge of the Mirelands. It was near dusk, the kind of twilight that paints everything gold and gay at the same time. The air was thick with rain, and the world smelled of soil and memory. He found the Ledger Lake. Then the mist began to roll in, soft and ghostly. The cabin was still there, leaning slightly, its porch sagging under the weight of years. The door creaked open easy, and inside he found nothing but dust, a cold hearth, and a carved phrase above the mantel. Don't listen for it. Listen with it. He didn't understand. Not yet. He spent days there. No devices, no data feeds, no distractions. Just him, the lake, and the soft rain. At first, all he heard was his own mind fighting itself, worries, regrets, echoes of boardrooms and deadlines. The noise inside him was louder than the quiet around him. But then, on the fourth night, the wind changed. It was turned by the lake, watching the moon shimmer faint through the fog when the hum returned, low, steady, and alive. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even constant, but it moved, rolled through him like a tide, humming in the ribs, in the chest, in the softest corners of the heart. It carried with it something old and unbroken. The same tone Wren had heard, the same ep Dran had followed, the same hum that Elias had coaxed from the soil with his hammer. Isaiah closed his eyes and did something he hadn't done since he was a boy. He hummed back. It came out rough, cracked, uncertain. But the hum answered, deepening, filling the air around him until he couldn't tell if it came from the world or from within. He saw flashes then, not visions exacted, but memories that weren't his own. Fields humming after rain, a forge sparking under starlight, a woman by a lake, her hands on the earth, a man tearing pages from a ledger, each one glowing like fireflies. The hum swelled until it broke into silence again, leaving him gasping and smiling all at once. When he opened his eyes, the rain had stopped. The lake was still, and yet he could feel an unseen rhythm pulsing beneath the surface. He finally understood the phrase, above the hearth. The hum wasn't a sound you hunted for. It was a space you joined. That night, Isaiah built a small fire and stayed up to dawn, writing his thoughts not in code or figures, but in words. By morning, he'd filled an entire journal with what he called the hum ledger. But unlike his old work, there were no profits, no losses, just lessons, reflections, gratitude. When travelers came months later, they found the cabin fixed up again. A new coat of paint, a stack of blank journals by the door, and one note carved into the tail right where the light hit best, leave a page, not a price. It became a ritual. Every visitor wrote a page, some about what they'd lost, some about what they'd found, not about nothing at that but the feeling of listening. Over the years, the pile grew into a library of sorts, not of knowledge, but of stillness, lections, narration cannery. They say if you flip through those pages under the moonlight, you can hear faint vibrations between the words, the hum written low through the ink, the earth itself signing its name again and again. Isaiah never left the Mirlands. He grew old there, teaching no one, preaching nothing, just living. When he passed, the villagers found his last page still wet with ink. It read, when you finally stop listening to get somewhere, that when you've arrived. The ledger lake never grew quiet after that. On stormy nights, the water ripples in time to a song older than memory, and wanderers still wallow its sound, searching not for answers but for peace, and those who find it never leave empty. Years faded like ink on old parchment, and the ledger lake slipped further into myth, yet myths, like embers and dying fires, don't go out easy. They wait for wind, and wind came carrying another wanderer, one who didn't believe in much of anything anymore. Her name was June Holler. Folks down south used to call her June, the broker of dreams. She'd made her fortune in a trade that was not goods or gold, but promises. She financed hope, bought people futures cheap, sold them dear, built towers, hired armies of talkers who could make a man believe his next step was the one that finally changed it. And for a while, it did, until the day her own dream turned hollow. She'd bought a mountain, literally carved her home into its bones, filled it with glass walls and silver floors. From up there, she could see everything. The glow of cities, the lines of highways, the hum of life below. But what she didn't see, what she couldn't hear, was herself. Every night she'd walk the halls, the hum of generators whispering through the vents, and she'd realize that all her riches couldn't buy silence, the right kind anyway, the silence that meant peace. So when she heard about the Ledger Lake, she thought it was just another scam, another myth ripe for investment. She set out to buy it. Took her convoy north trucks, guards, engineers, lawyers, but the further they went, the less the road obeyed their maps. GPS failed, engines coughed, radios hissed. By the time they reached the Mirlands, the machines just died. One by one, only June pressed on. She walked the last miles alone. Rain so thick it turned the world to watercolor. When she reached the lake, it wasn't grand or majestic. It was small, quiet, perfectly still. And she laughed. All that talk she said aloud for a puddle. Her voice came back soft, not an echo except more like a sigh. She frowned, leaned closer, and thought she saw the surface tremble. She dropped a pebble in. Ripples spread slow, silver under the gay sky, but halfway across they stopped, just stopped, as if the water had decided that was far enough. June knelt, touched it. The hum hit her like a slow pulse, deep, ancient, alive. It wasn't the vibration of industry or power. It was patience made sound, and for the first time in years, she didn't know what to say. She sat there for hours, watching mist roll across the water. When she finally stood, she felt different, not richer, not poorer, but lighter. The weight of her name, her empire, her ledger, all of it seemed to melt at morning fog. She turned to leave, but paused at the cabin. Its door was cracked open, as if waiting. Inside, everything was simple: wood, stone, a hearth, a wall of journals stacked high. She opened one. The handwriting changed every few pages, some neat and scrawled and smudged by tears or rain. She flipped through until she found Isaiah's note carved into the tape. Leave a page, not a price. She smiled, a bitter, broken kind of smile, and for the first time she understood what that meant. So she tore a page from her own planner, the one where she kept her contracts, her deals, her empire. On it she wrote 3 words: I forgive myself. Then he folded it, set it between the pages of the nearest journal, and walked back into the rain. When her convoy came, looking days later, they found the trucks abandoned and rusted, vines already crawling through the wheels. The guards said they heard a hum in the mist that made their hearts ache. They left soon after. None returned. As for June Holler, she was never seen in, but years later a traveler found a small wooden box washed up on the shore of the lake. Inside was a coin gold, perfectly polished, with words etched down its edge. A debt repaid by silence. No one knows if June carved it herself, but folks started leaving their own tokens in the water after that. Rhymes, notes, coins, carvings, each one a little confession, a quiet trade with the hum. The lake grew deeper, not in water but in memory. Generation later, a new kind of pilgrim came, people not looking for gold or glory, but for stillness. They built no monuments, no roads, just a narrow path of stone led into the water edge. There, they'd kneel and listen. Some cried, they smiled, they simply sat until dawn. And though the world beyond grew faster, louder, hungrier, the hum endured. It waded through every storm. It forgave every trespass. It sang not to be heard, but to remind those who found it that the world never forgot how to listen. It just forgot how to stop talking. If you ever wander that far north and you find yourself standing by a lake where even the wind holds its breath, try humming once, soft, patient, without wanting anything in return. You might hear her there, June Holler, sitting on a rock with her old coin in hand, standing out into the mist, not selling, not buying, just hemming. And when the rain starts to fall, it won't sound at sorrow, it'll sound at forgiveness finding its way home. Long after June Holler's story faded into fog and whispers, the Ledger Lake remained a quiet constant in a restless world. The cities had grown taller, their lights brighter, their engines louder. Yet somewhere deep in the mirelands, the hum still lived, untouched and unbothered. Few souls ventured that far anymore. The path was half swallowed by time and rain, and the maps had forgotten the way. But every few decades, someone would stumble across it. Not out of tow, but out of loss. That's how Tom Weaver found it. He wasn't a seeker or a dreamer. He was a tired ranch hand with more regrets than teeth. Life had been mean to him, but he'd given it plenty of reason to be. Lost his wife to drinking, his son to debt, his land to the bank. All that was left was his horse, an old paint mare named Clementine, and a harmonica he hadn't touched since his youth. He wasn't looking for salvation that day, just a place to rest. But sometimes rest and redemption wear the same boots. He rode north till the trails went thin, knowing no compass but the ache in his chest. Every night he camped under low clouds, humming tunes too sad to finish. Then, one evening, as the rain began to fall in soft, steady sheets, he heard something beneath the thunder, a low vibration humming through the ground. He thought it was his imagination till Clementine stopped mid-step, ears twitching. That's how he found it. The lake, the cabin, the stillness. At first, he just stared, The water didn't move, didn't ripple. Even the rain seemed to vanish before touching it. He tied Clementine by the porch, sat on the steps, and took the harmonica from his coat. It'd been years since he'd played, but his fingers remembered before his mind did. The first note came out cracked and lonely, the second steadied. By the third, the hum rose to meet him. It wasn't echoing, it was joining. Like the world was playing along. He kept playing until the storm passed, the last note hanging in the mist. Then, from somewhere deep across the lake, he heard another harmonica answer, soft, faint, but real. He froze, waited, blew another note, 3 long, 1 short. The answer came back the same. He chuckled, shook his head. "Reckon you're a good player, stranger," he muttered to the water. The hum deepened, like laughter traveling through stone. That night he stayed in the cabin, found the journals, the carvings, the coin on the mant tent. He read by lantern light, words from people long gone. Elias, Harad, Isaiah, June. Their stories bled together like verses of the say-old song. He slept easy for the first time in decades. Next morning, he woke to sunlight raking through fog. On the lake edge was a shape feminine, faint, transparent, as a dream. She sat cross-legged, humming low, her face turned toward the rising light. Tom rubbed his eyes, blinked hard. "She didn't vanish, ma'am," he croaked, voice rough. She turned, smiled. "You play well," she said. Her voice was like rain on tin soft, familiar. "Who are you?" She tilted her head. The pain to ask him he swallowed. "Just a man with too much pust." "Then I'm just a memory with not enough future," she said, eyes crinkled kindly. They sat quiet for a while. "You come for forgiveness?" she asked at last. "I don't know what I came for," he said. "World been taken from me so long I figured I'd come see what it's still given." She nodded. "Then listen." He tried. In the stillness he heard it, not her voice, not the wind, not even the hum. He heard himself, the boy who once played harmonica for his mama, the man who loved too hard and drank too long, the father who never said goodbye. Every memory rose, not like ghosts, but like friends coming home. He wept, quiet as rain. When he looked up again, she was gone. But in her place, on the rock where she'd sat, was a coin, not gold, not metal stone, smooth and warm, carved with the shape of a note. He picked it up, smiled. "Fair trade," he whispered. Stayed there the rest of his days, tending the cabin, playing for travelers when they came. They called him the Keeper, though he never claimed the title. Said he was just watching the lake till it was done watching him. And when he passed, they buried him right there on the porch, harmonica in, Clementine grazing beside him till her last breath. Now they say when storms roll through the mirelands, the wind carries 2 harmonicas playing together, one low, one high. The hum rides between, the rhythm of the earth itself. And if you happen to stand by the Ledger Lake on a rainy night, you might just hear the faint tit tune drift through the mist, a song too old for words, too simple for sadness. It's the song of forgiveness, played slow and true. The world listens, and for a moment it hums along. Years rolled onward like dust over prairie grass, and the Ledger Lake became a whisper in a world that forgot how to sit still. Planes filled the skies, wires crisscrossed the lands, and people carried more voices in their pockets than they had thoughts in their heads. But still that little patch of quiet water remained where it always had, waiting for whoever might still remember how to listen. Not many did anymore. But one day a girl came wandering through the mirelands, barefoot, soaked to the bone, and carrying nothing but a broken violin. Her name was Nora Delane. She wasn't running from trouble, she was running from noise. See, Nora had grown up in a city that never slept. The kind of place where every dream came with a deadline and every quiet moment got sold for someone else's idea of success. Her pa was a machinist, her ma a seamstress, and neither had time to notice when their daughter started hearing music and everything. The clink of a coin, the tick of a train, the sigh between words. She'd taught herself to play the violin from a junk heap instrument she'd found behind an old theater. By 14, she could make that thing cry like heaven itself was missing a piece. By 20, she was famous. By 25, she was empty. The city cheered, but Nora couldn't hear them anymore. Every stage she played, every encore she gave, it all felt hollow. The applause turned to static. The note stopped, meaning something. One night she broke her bow clean in half mid-performance, dropped the violin, and walked off stage. Didn't even look back. For weeks she drifted, caught trains without destinations, slept in barns, under bridges, sometimes nodded at. The music wouldn't leave her, but it wasn't songs anymore. It was hums, deep, low, familiar hums. And every night they grew louder, until one dawn, standing by the crossroads where its mist rolled low and thick, she saw an old signpost barely standing, letters carved by hand. It said to the Ledger Lake, "Leave your noise behind." She followed. Days passed, her feet bled, her violin cracked, but the hum drew her on, steady as a heartbeat. By the time she reached the lake, dusk had fallen. The world was gay and soft, the air thick with stillness. She fell to her knees at the water edge and laughed through tears. "You're real?" she whispered. The hum rose, faint but sure. She unclipped her violin case, pulled the broken thing from inside, and stared at it. The strings were frayed, the wood warped by weather. Still, she tucked it under her chin, closed her eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that came out wasn't music. It was memory. She played for her ma's tired hands, for her pa's calloused silence, for every stage that made her forget what silence meant. The notes were off, jagged, half sob and half song, and through it out the hum deepened, like the world itself was breathing with her. Then they heard another violin answer from across the lake. It was old, low, steady, a melody she didn't know, yet somehow remembered. She froze. The mist thickened, shapes dancing within it, shadowed, gentle, moving like the reflection of ghosts. They weren't there to scare her, they were listening. One by one, more instruments joined. An old harmonica, a soft hum, a hammer tap on anvil, the faint whisper of a forge, the rhythm of distant boots. It was as if every soul who had come to the Ledger Lake had returned. Not that echoes, but that part of the song. And when Nora struck the last note, the hum swelled deep, full, endless, and then fell quiet. She set her violin down, tears rolling free, not from sadness, but from the weight of peace. The mist parted, and there on the porch of the cabin sat a man with a worn hat and kind eyes, Tom Weaver. He wasn't older, wasn't younger, just timeless. He nodded once, tipped his hat. "You found it," he said. "What is it?" she whispered. He smiled. "Depending on who listening. Some say at the heart of the world, others say at the sound of all we've forgotten. Me, I just call it home." The hum returned, faint and steady beneath his words. "You stay along and you need," he said. "When you're ready, you'll know how to leave." She blinked, and he was gone. Only the hum remained. For days, Nora stayed by the lake, fixing her violin with scraps of bark and resin. When she played again, the notes came clean, honest, soft, true. When she finally left, she carried no map, no coin, no memory but the song itself. She wandered from town to town, playing by firesides, in barns, on porches. Folks didn't know who she was. But when she played, they'd swear the rain softened and the world stilled. They called her the Filler of Stillwater. And whenever someone asked what she was playing, she'd smile, look to the horizon, and say, "Just a tune I learned from a quiet place." Years later, travelers found her violin laid against a tree stump near the Ledger Lake. The strings were intact, the wood was polished, and carved into its back were 4 words: "The hum lives on." That night, a storm rolled through the mirelands, the wind humming low, the thunder rolling like drums. Some say it was the lake singing her home. Others say it was the world remembering her name. But those who truly listened, they heard her still, playing gentle through the rain. And in that moment, the hum wasn't a mystery anymore. It was the memory of peace. Long after Nora melody faded into the wind, the Ledger Lake lay untouched again. Seasons rolled like old film reels, snow to bloom, bloom to burn, burn to ash. And the world kept changing faster than any one soul could hold on to. The cities swallowed forests, the skies filled with metal wings, and the sound of coin never stopped ringing. But out there, where maps still refused to draw borders, the lake waited, quiet to heed breath before a prayer. One storm-tossed autumn, another wanderer stumbled upon it, a man named Silas Grady. He wasn't young nor old, just weatherer. His beard was gray at the chin, his coat patched and threadbare, carried a small chest chained to his back, heavy enough to bend his spine. He'd been walking for weeks, maybe months, chasing silence the way a man chases forgiveness he's not sure he deserves. They said Silas used to be a banker, not the kind who lent to neighbors or kept the town's savings safe. No, he ran a syndicate in the city, the kind that bought whole futures in one contract and sold them back at double price, made fortunes ruin faster than drought. And for every dollar he earned, someone else lost a roof, a ranch, or a family. One day, a woman came to his office, a widow with 2 kids and a debt too deep to crawl out of. She begged him to let her keep her home. Silas didn't even look up from the ledger, just signed her ruin with a silver pen. She didn't come back the next day, but her oldest boy did, with her locket in one hand and a stare that could haunt stone. Yes, didn't say a word, just dropped the locket on Silas' desk and left. That night, Silas tried to sleep. He couldn't. The hum began then, low, steady, somewhere between his ribs. He thought it was guilt at first, but it didn't fade. It grew. For years, he tried drowning it out. Money, whiskey, deals, travel. Nothing worked. The hum followed him through every marble hall and empty room, like a whisper asking for something he didn't have. So he sold his holdings, left his towers, packed his ledgers, and walked. The hum led him north. By the time he reached the Mirelands, the chains on his chest box had rusted near shut. The path was mud and stone, the sky a dull ache of gay. But when he saw the lake small, still, silver than old glass, he knew he'd come home to what had been Colin. He dropped the chest at the edge, fell to his knees, and stared at his reflection. His face looked older than he remembered. I brought it back, he muttered, voice cracking every coin, every debt, every name. The hum rose deep and steady, rolling through the ground like thunder with a heartbeat. He fumbled for the key, unlocked the chest, and threw it open. Inside were ledgers, hundreds of pages filled with numbers, signatures, and ruins. He tore one out, tossed it into the lake. It didn't sink. The water held it. The ink began to bleed, letters melting like secrets into the surface. He threw another, and another. Each page floated, shimmered, vanished. The more he threw, the louder the hum grew, until it shook his teeth, his bones, his shame. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for all of it." The wind shifted. Across the water, through the mist, he saw shapes, men and wind, faint in memory, standing on the far shore. Not angry, not accusing, just watching. Among them, he thought he saw a boy with a locket. Silas bowed his head. "Take it," he said, "all of it." Then he lifted the last ledger, the first he'd written, and placed it on the water. It floated still, pages glowing faint gold before dissolving into light. When it vanished, so did the hum. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was complete. Silas leaned back, eyes to the sky, and smiled for the first time in years. He felt weight leap, like a coin finally flipping to its edge and resting still. Then he lay down, the rain coming soft, and let it wash him clean. When morning came, the chest was gone. Only his boots remained on the shore, pointed toward the horizon. Travelers who came later said they sometimes saw faint gold flecks under the lake surface, glinting like stars caught underwater. They doubted the banker redemption. Over time, those flecks spread. The water shimmered at dawn now, like every sin cast into it found its light again. And when storms came, folks swore they could hear the faint clink of coins beneath the thunder-soft, rhythmic forgiving. But no one feared it. They knew what it meant. The world was still keeping count. But the lake was learning how to forgive what it once recorded. Every year, wanderers still came, merchants, drifters, dreamers, broken souls, all leaving a piece of themselves at that quiet shore, not out of fear, not even out of faith. But because they knew the hum wasn't as a sound, it was a promise that somewhere beyond the noise there was still a place where even the worst of men could find stillness, and even the heaviest of ledgers could close without a number left unbalanced. And the lake, K-Shin-Te-Zed, kept listening. It always would. Decades slipped by, and the world grew louder still. There came a time when the night itself seemed to hum, not with peace, but with the ceaseless buzz of wires, engines, and restless minds. Cities gleamed like constellations fallen to earth, yet their light brought little warmth. For legends are patient things. They outlast the rise of steel and the breaking of silence. Somewhere beyond the highways and the towers, the ledger lake remained, hiding behind fog and time, waiting for the ones the noise forgot. That's how Henry Coulter found it. He was no dreamer, just an old rail engineer whose years had gone by in a blur of smoke and motion. He'd been part of the great western expansion, laying steel from horizon to horizon, his hammer striking rhythm into the heart of America. The trains had been his life iron veins, pumping progress through a wild land, but progress, like fire, don't know when to stop eating. By the time Henry was 70, the trains he'd built had turned into machines he didn't recognize. The crews had vanished, replaced by buttons and circuits. Even the stations felt cold now. No laughter, no tobacco smoke, no stories traded between whistles, just schedules, screens, and silence too mechanical to be holy. He'd retired, or maybe the world retired him. His pension was small, his house smaller. His kids had gone off to lives too busy for old tracks and ghost stories. So one morning, when the city choked with fog and sirens, Henry packed a small rucksack, left his key on the counter, and took the first outbound freight that didn't ask questions. He didn't have a destination, just a direction away. He rode for 3 days, sleeping by coal bins and under stars that still dared to shine. Then, one dusk, he heard a sound that made him sit upright, the fainted low hum beneath the rattle of the train. Familiar, but impossible. When the train slowed near an old forgotten line branching into forest, Henry hopped off. The hum grew louder with every step. He followed it through fog and briar, down to the mirelands, where the air hung heavy with rain and memory. When he reached the lake, he stopped cold. He'd been Hen before, not in body, but in dreams, those long nights in sleeper cars when the wheels sang soft and the horizon never ended. This was the sound he'd always heard between stations, that patient hum beneath all things. He dropped his rucksack by the shore and knelt. The water reflected not his face, but tracks, shimmering rails, stretching to infinity. He laughed, low and shaky. Guess I ain't lost, I thought. From his pack, he pulled out his old pocket watch. It was cracked, tarnished, and no longer ticking. He'd wound it every day of his life, even when there wasn't reason to. Now he flipped it open one last time. Inside, a photo. Him and his crew, all smiles and soot, standing by a newly built bridge. Most were gone now, but the hum carried their laughter just the same. Henry held the watch to his chest. "You boys hear that?" he whispered. "We did good." The hum swelled. The lake rippled for the first time in years, and in that shimmer he saw them, his crew, young again, leaning on their hammers, grinning. One of them, a red-haired fella named Clyde, waved. "Come on, old man," he said, voice reading the wind. "We've been waiting on you." Henry smiled. "Reckon I'm late, not dead," Clyde said. "No clock's where we are." Henry laughed. "Good. Never did trust the damn things." He stood, hat in hand, and stepped into the shallows. The water rose around his boots, humming louder now, not a warning, but a welcome. As it reached his chest, he looked up at the gay sky. "If the rails lead anywhere," he said softly, "I hope they end there." Then he took one last step. The water closed over him like glass melting into silence. When dawn came, the lake shimmered faintly with streaks of silver, like rails etched beneath its surface. Travelers who came after swore that on quiet nights, when the wind blew east, you could hear the faint whistle of a train in the distance, slow, mournful, never arriving, never leaving. They called it the last line. Some said it carried the souls of builders, dreamers, and the tired-hearted, all heading somewhere beyond noise, somewhere still. And sometimes, when thunder rolled like a far-off engine, folks swore they could hear Henry Coulter's voice riding the storm, laughing low. "Keep them tracks straight, boys. Having a long ride, but we're getting there." The Ledger Lake stayed quiet, shimmering polished steel. In its hum lived every note it played, every regret forgiven, every man and woman who found their peace on its edge. It didn't judge, it didn't take sides, it just kept the rhythm steady in the earth's own pulse, because the truth was never that the lake spoke, it listened. And every once in a while, when a soul finally grew quiet enough, it answered, not in words, but in understanding. Maybe that's what eternity really was. Not gold streets or clouds or wings, just one endless, peaceful hum under a soft, gay sky, where every story ended not with a bang, but with a breath. There came a winter unlike any the Marlands had then known, the kind that crept in slow and stayed too long when frost kissed the cattails to glass, and the trees bowed low under the weight of silence. The Ledger Lake, that patient mirror of souls, froze clean through. It gleamed like silver stone under the moonlight, and for the first time in generations, even the hum fell still. The townsfolk whispered that the world itself was holding its breath, but in a cabin on the far side of the valley, half swallowed by snowdrifts and pine, a man named Jonas Merrick sat by a dying fire, staring at the last ember glowing in the ash. He wasn't a banker or a musician or a builder. He was a keeper of stories, a writer of other men's legends, and a man who never quite found one of his own. He'd spent a lifetime chasing truth through words, but all they found were echoes of what he thought mattered. Success had come early, fame followed fast, but both burned out quick, like wet matches in the wind. He'd written 100 books, maybe more, some about heroes, some about heartbreak, all about people braver than himself, yet not one had satisfied him. It beat it, the kind that crept in slow and stayed too long when frost kissed the cattails to glass, and the trees bowed low under the weight of silence. The ledger lake, that patient mirror of souls, froze clean through. It gleamed like silver stone under the moonlight, and for the first time in generations, even the hum fell still. The townsfolk whispered that the world itself was holding its breath. But in a cabin on the far side of the valley, half swallowed by snowdrifts and pine, a man named Jonas Merrick sat by a dying fire, staring at the last ember glowing in the ash. He wasn't a banker or a musician or a builder. He was a keeper of stories, a writer of other men's legends, and a man who never quite found one of his own. He'd spent a lifetime chasing truth through words, but all they found were echoes of what he thought mattered. Success had come early, fame followed fast, but both burned out quick, like wet matches in the wind. He'd written 100 books, maybe more, some about heroes, some about heartbreak, all about people braver than himself, yet not one had satisfied him. Now at 63, his hand shook too bad to hold a pen steady, and his thoughts scattered like sparrows when he tried to chase meaning. His publisher had long since stopped calling. His readers had moved on to louder stories, faster ones. The world didn't want quiet anymore. It wanted noise dressed up paid revelation. So Jonas did the only thing left that felt honest. He walked away. He left the city without telling a soul. It carried a bag of old journals and a flask of coffee gone cold. No map, no bed. Just one ache gnawing in his chest, the feeling that he'd spent his whole life describing peace, but never once lived it. He wandered west for weeks, through forests, towns, and ghost places where even his name meant nothing, until one evening, half frozen, he stumbled into a clearing where the fog hung low and strange. There it was, the Ledger Lake, still, glassy, locked under ice so clear it reflected stars from both heaven and memory. Jonas dropped to his knees, breath fogging in the air. "So it real," he muttered, his voice a rasp. "You are real." He didn't know who he was talking to. Phineas, maybe himself? Maybe view the stories that led him made. He crawled closer to the edge, palm against the frozen surface. It was cold, sharp enough to sting, but beneath that ice he could see shapes moving. Not fish, not shadows, letters. Thousands of letters drifting like fireflies trapped underwater, forming words he couldn't quite read. He leaned closer. The hum returned, faint, mournful, ancient. Jonas closed his eyes and let it fill him. Every note sank into his chest, heavy with the kind of truth he'd spent years trying to explain and failing. The hum didn't tell him a story. It reminded him of one he'd forgotten to write. He pulled his old leather journal from his coat. It was near full pages of scribbles, quotes, starts of novels that went nowhere. He opened to the last blank page, and for the first time in decades he didn't think. He listened. His pen moved slow at first, like a man learning how to pray. The hum guided him, not in words but rhythm. He wrote about Nora and her violin, about Silas and his ledgers, about Henry riding the eternal rails. Wrote about the way stillness had a voice, how forgiveness didn't come from apology but from understanding. The pen never stopped. When his hand cramped, he switched to the margins. When the ink froze, he thought it with his breath. The hours slipped by unnoticed, and as he wrote, the ice began to thaw. A thin crack formed from the center of the lake, spiderwebbing outward, hemming louder with every line he laid to paper. By dawn, the hum was everywhere, in the cabin walls, the frozen ground, the marrow of his bones. Then the ink ran out. Jonas looked down. Every page was full, but he hadn't written his name once, only theirs, the ones who came before. He smiled faintly. Guessed at the story after all. He tore the journal free, walked out to the lake, and set it on the ice. It slid from his hands and drifted to the center, resting on the crack that had begun to glow with pale light. Then, with a low groan, the ice gave way. The journal sank beneath. Pages spread and open, it breathing at last. The hum rose, warm and full now, filling the whole valley. Jonas stood there, bathed in that sound, and laughed through tears. "There you are," he whispered. "The ending." He sat down on the snow, watching the lake ripple under the surface until it faded back to stillness. When the sun broke over the trees, the lake had frozen again, smooth, untouched, whole. When travelers passed through the Marlins come spring, they found a cabin with its door open, ashes cold, and on the table, Jonas Merrick, pen. The nib was worn to nothing. On the wall above the hearth, carved into the wood, were words that shimmered faintly when the wind passed through. The story never ends. It just listens. And for years to come, those who camped near the lake swore that on still nights you could hear the scratch of a pen beneath the water, writing slow and steady, as if the hum itself was telling the world next chapter. They paid it the writer echo. And so the Ledger Lake became not just a place of peace, but of remembrance. For every song unsung, every apology left unspoken, every story half-finished, it didn't matter who you were when you came or what you'd done before. The hum didn't judge. It took your noise and turned it into music the world would never forget. Because Zud's stories weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be heard in the silence between heartbeats. And that silence, eternal, gentle, alive, was the truest sound of all. Spring came late that year, soft and cautious, as though the world feared disturbing the hush that lingered over the Ledger Lake. The thaw came in whispers, melted ice that wept in rivulets down to the roots, birds singing again in low tones like they knew they were guests in a chapel of stillness. The lake breathed anew, clear and slow, rippling only when the wind brushed its back. But in that season, a new kind of pilgrim came. Not a banker, nor a musician, nor a builder of railways or words. This one was a woman named Abigail Wren. She was a prospector once, though her gold had never come from the earth. Abigail had spent her life in the canyons of commerce, buying, selling, flipping, hustling. She could turn a ledger line into a fortune and a handshake into a contract sharper than a knife. Folks called her Iron Abby, because once she set her sights on something, not even mountains could make her turn back. But iron rusts. By the time she hit 50, her empire had turned on her. The market crashed, her partners jumped ship, and her name, once whispered in awe, was now muttered like a curse. The headlines painted her a villain, though none of them knew how many nights she'd gone without sleep, how many years she'd traded laughter for profit margins. When the dust settled, Abigail had nothing left but a briefcase, a heart too heavy for its own bones, and a silence that followed her like a debt collector. So she left the city and walked until she couldn't hear the sound of her own name. Through rain, through hunger, through miles of thoughts she wished she'd never borrowed. She came upon the Ledger Lake at dusk, though she didn't know its name yet. Just saw the shimmer through the trees and thought maybe she'd found the kind of quiet that doesn't judge. Abigail dropped her briefcase by the water and sat. The surface reflected not the woman she was, but the girl she used to be, barefoot, curious, unburdened. She let out a breath that sounded more like a confession. I broke a lot of things chasing what couldn't be kept. The hum answered, faint in the memory of thunder. She let up, startled, then smiled. Guess even ghosts got opinions. From her case, she pulled a single document, an old contract, yellowed at the corners. It was the first one she assigned, back when she thought success was the same thing at worth. The ink had faded, but she knew every word by heart. She tore it clean in half. The lake didn't move, but somewhere beneath the ripples she felt it, a pulse, slow and steady, beaten in rhythm with her own. So she tore another page, then another. Every scrap she threw into the water sank eye stone, leaving rings that shimmered gold before it disappeared. I thought I was building something, she said softly. Turns out I was digging. The hum deepened warm now, carrying through her like a hot flame. Abigail stood feeling the ache in her knees, but not minding it. She walked into the shallows until the water reached her waist, then nut out across the horizon. What are you really? She whispered. A Graham, a mirror, a judge? The hum shifted again, tender and low. Ignorance. No, she said after a moment. You're a listener. And in that realization, she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in 20 years. She stayed there to dawn, just listening. When she left, she didn't take the briefcase, didn't take the papers, only her ring. A plain silver band she'd worn since her husband passed. She placed it on a flat stone at the shore, where it caught the sunrise like a promise unbroken. Travelers who found it later said that whenever the sun hit that ring, the lake shimmered in molten coin, and you could hear faint laughter in the wind. They started calling her the Iron Widow of Ledger Lake, But she wasn't mourning. She was remembered by those who came after as the one who proved that forgiveness don't come from begging or bartering. It comes from finally listening to the quiet you've been running from all your life. The lake kept listening patient, ate always. It never claimed her body nor her name, just her noise. And that was enough. Years passed. The legend spread again, this time not through word of mouth, but through stories whispered over campfires, written in journals, sung by wanderers who'd found their way there. The Ledger Lake became something more than sacred. It became useful, not in a worldly way, but in the way that heals men too far gone to believe in healing. Fathers brought their sons, lovers came with burdens they couldn't name, soldiers left behind medals, preachers left behind doubts, and every one of them found the same thing, not answers, not redemption, just the still hum of understanding, because the truth, the one the world keeps forgetting, is that peace ain't a place you earn, it a sound you remember, and the lake remembered for all who'd forgotten. Even now when thunder cracks over the Marlins and the rain dances like old fingers on the roof of the world, the hum rides the storm, humming through the bones of the mountains, the roots of the trees, the hearts of the lost. It ain't a warning, it ain't a song, it's a reminder that no matter how far you run from yourself, there's always a place, quiet, patient, and time where you can set your burdens down and then listen. Summer rolled in slow that year. If time itself didn't have the heart to hurry through the Marlins. The tall grass swayed gold under the sun, the wind carried the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet, and the Ledger Lake shimmered like a silver coin flipped between the fingers of God. It looked peaceful, but the peace was not idle. It was watching. That lake had seen too much to sleep. Down the slope from the water edge, a road had formed not by design, but by footsteps, hundreds, maybe thousands, all coming to the same place for reasons they couldn't explain. Each print told a story. Boots of wanderers, sandals of seekers, bare feet of the broken. Some left gifts behind coins, carvings, old letters. Others left nothing at that but silence. The hum had a way of giving back what words couldn't. And one day, a man came whose silence could fill the whole valley. His name was Clay Hartwell. He'd been a sheriff once, back when the law was these rough of the land it tried to tame. It wasn't crooked, but he'd made his peace with the gay in between. When you've seen enough blood and sorrow, right and wrong start looking mighty similar in bad light. He'd kept his badge longer than most, long enough to watch every man he trusted end up in the dirt or behind bars. In the end, he didn't quit the job so much as the job quit him. His town fell quiet, too quiet, and the folks left had eyes that looked past him instead of toward him. So one morning, Clay took off the badge, laid it on his kitchen table, and walked out. Didn't pack more than a revolver, a Bible with his wife's name etched inside, and a flask that rattled empty before sundown. Walked until the trails turned to dust, and the dust turned to memory. That how he found himself standing for the Ledger Lake, boots sunk in the mud, staring at a reflection that looked older than the man he felt like. He spat, just to prove he was still solid, then muttered, "Heard about this place." The hum rose like a sigh. Clay chuckled low. "Yeah, that what they said you'd do." He dropped down on a rock and pulled the Bible from his coat. It was torn, stained with rain and whiskey. Inside the cover was a photo of him and his wife Ellie, smiling with that kind of faith that only first years of marriage can hold. She'd been gone near 20 winters now. Illness took her fast, and he'd spent the years since pretending the silence didn't hurt. He turned the photo over. On the back, in her handwriting, were 4 words. "Find peace, you stubborn fool." He laughed. "It came out cracked, still bossing me around, huh?" The hum deepened like it was smiling too. Looked out across the lake, hat tipped low, and spoke the way a man does when he knows nobody around to lie to. "I done things I ain't proud of," he said. "Shot men who might have deserved a chance, let others walk who didn't. I carried that badge like it was God's hand, and maybe that was my sin, thinking I could fix the world with lead and leather." The water didn't stir, but the sound of it, soft and deep, moved through him like forgiveness. "Thing is," he went on, "it weren't the bullets that broke me, it was the silence after. You pull a trigger long enough, you start thinking the quiet that follows is peace. But it ain't. A ghost waiting for a word." He reached for the flask, realized it was empty again, and tossed it into the lake. It sank with barely a splash. "You listen, huh?" he asked. "That what they'll say?" The hum answered low and patient. Clay nodded. "Good. I got a lot to say." He talked to the moon rose, spoke of the men he'd buried, the ones he couldn't save, the ones he wished he'd never met. Told the lake about his daughter, born too late and dawned too soon. Told it about Ellie laughed, and how the sound of it was the only thing louder than guilt, and the lake didn't interrupt, didn't soothe, didn't preach, it did listen. By dawn, Clay's voice was gone, his throat dry, his eyes red, his heart lighter. He stood, knees creaking, and looked one last look at the badge in his hand. "You were heavy company," he said. Then he tossed it out across the water. It hit with a soft plunk and disappeared. For a moment the lake went still, then the hum rose again, louder, richer, and from the center, where the badge had sunk, a faint glimmer spread like sunrise caught beneath the surface. Clay smiled. "Guess that's your way of saying thanks." He turned and started walking back through the fog, but halfway up the trail, he stopped, looking over his shoulder one last time. "Tell Ellie I'm working on it," he said, voice rough but steady. And maybe it was the wind, maybe not, but the hum answered back in a tone that sounded awful close to laughter. After that day, the folks who came to Ledger Lake said the water sometimes shone gold at sunset like metal under heat. They said if you listened close, you could hear the faint jingle of spurs and the sound of footsteps walking away, never hurried, never lost. They bade it the sheriff farewell, and in the hum his story joined the others. Not that a confession, not a warning, but the reminder that the hardest part of redemption ain't asking for it, it believing you deserve to be heard. The Ledger Lake listened on, change less, truth eternal, aid mercy. Every ripple carried a name, every breeze a lesson, every silence a promise. And for those who wandered too long in the noise of their own lives, it waited, patient, endless, and kind, ready to hum back whatever they needed most to remember. By autumn, the Ledger Lake had become more than a legend. It was a living memory stitched into the fabric of every wanderer tale. The kind of place you didn't find by map but by need. Word of it spread through saloons and train cars, through letters never sent and dreams never explained. Folks said it had a pull of gravity, drawn the weary and the lost, the proud and the penitent, all to that same quiet shore where the world seemed to listen better than people did. That was how Ezekiel Boone found it. He wasn't a lawman nor a musician, and he sure wasn't a saint. Ezekiel was a trader, silver-tongued, sharp-eyed, born with a compass that pointed only toward profit. He'd crossed the continent twice over, selling everything from whiskey to wind, made his fortune early, lost it twice, rebuilt it 2 times bigger. His hands were clean, but his conscience wasn't, and deep down he knew the difference. The last deal that broke him wasn't the biggest, it was just the one that cost him his brother. See, Ezekiel and Caleb Boone had started poor, dirt poor. They'd built their first store together in a one-room shack, taking turns at the counter while the other hunted or hauled wood. They trusted each other the way most men trust the sunrise, but when money started rolling in, greed came along riding shotgun. Caleb wanted to give back, build schools, feed the miners' kids, make something good out of the gold. Ezekiel wanted to build empires. One night, papers were signed without consent, numbers changed without permission, and by dawn, Caleb was gone. No note, no goodbye, just silence and a debt that couldn't be paid in dollars. Ezekiel spent 20 years trying to drown that silence with work, travel, wind, and whiskey. But how debts don't vanish, they just wait. And one day, sitting by a cracked window in a town too small for a name, he overheard a whisper about a lake that could listen. He laughed at first, but that night he couldn't sleep. The thought of being heard, really heard, itched like a wound that never healed. So come sunrise, he saddled up and rode west. He rode through plains that stretched longer than regret and forests that whispered things he didn't want to remember. His horse died halfway there, so he walked the rest. By the time he reached the Mirelands, his boots were worn to ghosts and his pride was hanging by a thread. The lake greeted him with silence deeper than guilt. Knelt at the edge, breathing heavy, hat low over his eyes. So this is the place, he said, the one that listens. The hum answered faintly, like a voice too old to startle him. He smiled bitterly, 'cause I ain't got much left worth saying, but I reckon you'll hear me out anyway. He reached into his coat and pulled out a letter. The paper was worn thin, edges burnt from 2 near misses with a campfire. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. I forgive you, Zeke. Always did. You were just better at wanting than I was at waiting. Caleb, Ezekiel's throat tightened. Found this in a box of old receipts, he said. Guess he sent it after I left 20 years, and I only saw it last week. He tore it slow down the middle. Don't deserve it, but maybe he'd want me to say something anyway. He stared out across the water. I took what wasn't mine, not money, Trust. That's the worst theft a man can commit. You can pay back gold, you can rebuild a house, but when you steal belief, there ain't a currency in the world that covers that. The hum deepened, low and mournful, rolling across the surface like distant thunder. Ezekiel reached into his sachets and pulled out a small pouch. Inside were coins, real silver, dull from age, stamped with the Boone mercantile crest. He'd carried them for decades, thinking maybe he could start over somewhere else, rename it, rebrand his legacy. Instead, he poured them into the lake. Each coin fell with a small splash, ringing like chimes underwater. The sound lingered long after the ripples faded. "You can keep it," he said. "Maybe you'll spend it better than I did." He sat there to dusk, watching the water glow faintly where the silver had sunk. Then he spoke again, quiet paid prayer. "I thought wealth was about gathering. Turns out it about releasing. Every coin, every deal, every lie, it all the weighs you down till you can't move. But when you let it go, hell, it's lighter than air." For the first time in years, Ezekiel Boone smiled, soft, small, honest. When the moon climbed high, he lay down on the bank, hat over his eyes, hum lulling him, make an old lullaby. By the time dawn painted the water gold, he was gone, peaceful, still, no mark but a smile that time couldn't wash away. They found him days later sitting there. He just paused to rest. The water beside him shimmered silver under the sun, and near his hand lay a small stone with his brother name carved into it. Nobody had claimed his body. The townsfolk buried him under the old oak, right where the path met the lake. And from that day on, the travelers who came there started leaving silver coins in the shallows, not for luck, but for lightning. They called it Boone trade, a deal made in reverse, a trade where losing was the profit, where letting go was the gain, and the ledger lake you'll each offering without judgment, humming softly as if to say, this is the only wealth that lasts. Years later, when the storms rolled across the plains, folks claimed the thunder echoed at coins falling into deep water. Some said it was just weather. Others said it was the sound of Boone silver still sinking, still teaching men how to let go. Winter came earlier than expected that year. The first snow settled soft over the Milands, muting the colors of autumn into something quiet, pale, and holy. The Ledger Lake didn't freeze right away. It resisted the cold like an old storyteller refusing to leave the fire before the tale was done. But by mid-December, the surface had turned to glass, clear enough to see faint glimmers beneath, the ghosts of coins, rings, letters, badges, all resting in the silt like a treasury of lost burdens. Travelers still came, bundled tight against the wind, breath steaming in the chill. They didn't come for miracles. They came for remembrance. That hum, though softer now, still threaded through the air, a sound not of this world, steady as the heartbeat of the earth itself. That was when Silas Vane appeared. He wasn't famous nor infamous. He wasn't even remembered by most of the towns he passed through. Silas was the kind of man life forgot to count. One of those drifters who never stayed long enough to plant roots or raise a roof. He'd been a ranch hand, a miner, a preacher helper, and once for a year a husband. But nothing stuck. He moved like a shadow, talking little, carrying less. What set him apart wasn't his story, but his silence. There was a weight in it, not heavy like guilt, but hollow like absence. He'd heard of Ledger Lake through a boy he met in a saloon, barely 16, drunk on both whiskey and wonder. It a magic place, the boy said. You tell it what you lost, and it hums it back to you so you don't forget who you were. Silas had laughed back then, but now, months later, he wasn't laughing. He had nowhere left to be, no one waiting on him, and a hunger that wasn't for food. So he followed that pull through the frostbitten plains until the lake revealed itself at dusk, a wide sheet of frozen silver beneath a sky bruised with storm. He stopped a few feet from the edge, snow crunching beneath his boots, breath fogging in the cold. He stared down at the ice, seeing his reflection warped and doubled, one face alive, one ghost. Reckon you've been hearing stories about yourself, he muttered. Funny thing, having a reputation and not being alive to defend it? The hum rose faintly, almost too soft to notice. He crouched, touching the ice. You're quieter than I thought. Reached into his coat and pulled out a locket. Inside was a single strand of red hair, faded and brittle, wrapped around a gold band. The inscription read, "For every tomorrow." She was called Clara, he said, his voice barely above the wind. Best thing that had happened to me, or the worst, depending how you look at it. He chuckled once, dry, tired. Met her at a church social in Abilene. She laughed like rain hitting tin. I was too dumb to know what to do with a woman like that, so I just listened. Married her 6 months later, thought that was the start of forever. Turns out forever shorter than a winter sunrise. Fever took her before the year was done. Doctor said there was nothing could be done. I didn't believe him. I buried her myself under a cottonwood and swore I'd never stop trying to make sense of it. He looked out over the lake, eyes distant. That was 30 years old. The hum deepened, rolling low through the ice. I kept moving after that, he said. Told myself I was looking for work, for peace, for something, but truth is I was just trying not to stop. To stop and meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling. He laid the locket down on the ice, the metal clinking softly. I don't got much left to trade. But maybe you'll take this, she used to say. Love don't die, it waits for you to quit. Being stubborn. The hum pulsed once deep, resonant, kind. The ice beneath the locket began to glow faintly, light seeping through cracks like dawn through curtains. Silas smiled, though his eyes were wet. Guess she was right. He stayed there all night, humming under his breath old hymns, half-remembered lullabies, fragments of verse that used to mean hope. And though the cold bit deep, he didn't shiver. By morning, travelers found him sitting upright, hat in his lap, peace on his face. The ice beneath him had melted in a perfect circle, water shimmering soft gold. The locket was gone, but the hum lingered stronger than before, like the lake itself had been warmed by the memory. They thought that circle Clara mirror. In spring, flowers started growing out, that patch wild blossoms that bloomed even when frost still clung to the grass elsewhere. Folks said the lake had turned a piece of grief into beauty, a wound into seed, and every year after, lovers and widows, dreamers and mourners came to that spot, touching the thawed earth, whispering names of those they'd lost. The lake would hum back, never the same twice, never too loud, just enough to say, they're still here, you just gotta listen softer. Over time, the Ledger Lake became a place not just for the guilty or the weary, but for the ones who'd loved too deeply, too briefly. It didn't promise reunion or redemption, it promised remembrance, and that was enough. By the time the next winter rolled round, the hum had grown so familiar that the people nearby swore they could hear it even in their sleep. They said it was like the lake was singing them dreams, not of riches, not of youth, but of rest. And for those who'd lived long enough to forget what peace sounded death, that hum became a lullaby that never ended. The years drifted by, and the Ledger Lake remained unchanged, unclaimed, yet alive in a way that only still things can be. Wind carved stories into its surface. Rain stitched songs into the soil. Every traveler who came left behind something invisible, guilt, grief, gratitude. And the hum wove it out together like thread through old quilt. The land around it began to grow rich, not in crops or coin, but in calm. It became a place where even the restless could sleep. But not everyone came to unburden. Some came to understand. One of them was a young man named Har-Ran Quinn. He wasn't broken, not exactly, but he was bent like a fence post that had taken one too many storms. Horrid had grown unhearing about the Ledger Lake from his grandfather, a man who swore he'd seen the water glow back when he was young and foolish, said it saved him from walking into the desert with a gun in his hand. Back then, Horrid thought it was a bedtime story, just something the old man said to make the dark seem smaller. Then the old man passed, and Horrid found a letter among his things. The ink had faded, but the words were steady. If you find yourself lost, not the kind where you don't know where you are, but the kind where you don't know who you are, go to the Ledger. It'll remind you what's worth keeping. The journey was not long, but it felt like years. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the way the land seemed to stretch time. By the time he reached the lake, dusk had already draped itself across the hills, and the air carried the smell of pine and rain-soaked dust. The end up on the street, hit the air to your side. I don't know. They don't supposed to do anymore.
Keith stood at the water edge, breathing suddenly. He said aloud, "Look where the world listens." The hum answered, a low, patient sound that moved through his boots and straight up his spine. He crouched down, looking at his reflection. Name Har-Ran Quinn. I don't reckon you care about that. I ain't here to confess or to ask for nothing. I just don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. He took off his hat, raked his fingers through his hair. Been working in the city these past few years. Numbers, contracts, promises that ain't worth the paper they're printed on. Built a good living, but somewhere along the way, I stopped living. You had that happen? You blink and realize your whole life just receipts and alarms? The hum deepened, soft but sure. He smiled faintly. Guess you have. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were 3 things. A silver pocket watch, a folded newspaper clipping, and a single seed, dry, small plane. My granddad gave me this watch, he said. Stopped working the day he died.
I tried fixing took it to clocksmiths, even swapped parts, but it never ticked again. Guess it didn't want to move forward without him. He set it down on the shore. Then he opened a clipping. It was a headline from years old. Local Band's Entrepreneur Award. The future is gold, says Harlan Quinn. He stared at it for a long moment. That was me. Everyone shook my hand, said I was going places. I thought that meant money, fame, the kind of success folks could see. Turns out the more you chase gold, the less light it gives off. It's like holding a candle in a storm.
He placed the clipping beside the watch. Then he lifted the seed. And this is from the tree behind my granddad's house. He used to say everything important starts small and invisible. Said patience was the richest man virtue. He looked out across the water. I don't know what I believe anymore, but maybe he was right. He pressed the seed into the cold mud at the edge of the lake, covering it gently with his hand. The hum grew louder, not angry, not sad, yet alive.
The surface of the lake rippled, though no wind blew. Lights shimmer beneath. The stars trapped under glass. Harlan blinked. You listening? The hum answered, and the ripples pulsed outward in rhythm steady like the heartbeat of something too big to name. He sat there until night wrapped around him, the moon floating like a lantern over the water. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the itch of urgency. He didn't feel the weight of clocks or calendars, just presence. By morning, the ground where he buried the seed was warm, steam rising faintly from the soil. He brushed the dirt aside and froze. A sprout, tiny, green, alive. He laughed, a sound that startled even him. Well, I'll be damned. He stayed a while longer, long enough to carve a small wooden marker that read simply, Patience Grows. When he finally left, he took nothing, not the watch, not the clipping, just the silence humming behind him like a melody he'd known his whole life but never learned to sing. Years later, travelers spoke of a tree that grew by the lake edge, tall and strong, its roots drinking from the water hum. They said it bloomed even in drought, leaves shimmering silver in moonlight. They paid it the listening tree. People came from miles around to sit beneath it, to rest their backs against its trunk and talk about losses, loves, fears, and hopes. The lake listened. The tree did too. And if you sat still long enough, I swore you could hear faint whispers in the wind, old voices reminding you that what worth keeping don't ever leave if debt changes shape. So the Ledger Lake went on, part legend, part truth, eternal forgiveness, patient and time. It didn't fix what was broken. It just made peace with it. And for most folks, that was more than enough.